There's a new Smash game on the way. You know there is. There always is. And with that comes new Pokémon. And you can take a pretty good guess what that means. It's going to be some kind of Gen 1 nostalgia bait, or a starter, or a pseudo-legendary from the most recent release. That's pretty much all you get. But what if it didn't have to be? What if it could be anything? What if there's a Pokemon Trainer Mark II who pulls from different generations? Maybe even a couple of them, or hell, what if Pokemon just straight up makes their own platform fighter at some point? It's not like they don't have a history of dipping their toes into competitive genres. I'm gonna keep it in the realm of Smash for this video, case in point, but the main thing I'm getting at is I'm doing a ranking of how well I think every Pokemon could work as a Smash fighter, and while I will still give some boost to fan favorites and stuff like that, the fact that they're not a quote-unquote realistic pick isn't really being penalized in this list. Also, hey, this more casual tier list format is usually something I reserve for my second channel, Mock Rock Talk, but considering this one has 1,000 Pokemon and 20 guest slots that I have to wrangle, I'm hoping there's enough effort put in that this feels worthy of the main channel for once. This was only really viable because it turned into a full-on coding project, by the way. I'm not going to drop all the details here, but yeah, there was some serious behind-the-scenes work on this one. All right, let's get into it. Hey everyone, just a heads up that while this is the first video in a two-part series, I did make sure to get all of the guest slots into this one. If there's one particular guest that you came to see, I've got their segment timestamped in the pinned comment, but I haven't done this in the video description or timeline to avoid spoilers, so, you know, take that into account. Let's start with Kabutops as a nice kind of representative one. As far as body shape goes, this is pretty much textbook, right? Obviously, the main feature is those giant scythe arms, but then you've got a big head and you've got back spines and you've got a tail, and canonical size isn't even really an issue. It's 4 feet tall, it just basically drops right in. Forward smash, perfect place to use X Scissor. Side special, that's an Aqua Jet burst movement option. Up special, it can use Stone Edge and stick its claws into the stones as they're rising. And we already have water Pokemon represented in Smash, but nothing rock. That's a cool typing. So all the boxes are ticked. The only real question is how exciting a choice is Kabutops. And even as someone who really likes it, it's one of my all-time favorite rock-type Pokemon, it's just doesn't really do that much that I think other Pokemon on this list wouldn't necessarily do better. Very solid A tier in my eyes, though. As far as Kabuto goes, that's going to be in just use the evolution tier. That's not to say this is where every pre-evolution needs to go, though. For example, Charizard is already in Smash, but Charmeleon isn't. And I think this could actually be a pretty cool Echo Fighter. Obviously, by far the most prominent difference between the two is Charmeleon does not have wings, so you would need to change its run animation, and you would need to change a couple moves from Charizard, mostly the upwards phasing ones, and then obviously it wouldn't be able to triple jump anymore, and then you've got a smaller, faster, weaker Charizard with a few new moves, which is exactly the kind of thing I'd like to see Echo Fighters be. So does it help that Charmeleon is one of my favorite fire-type Pokemon and that I actually prefer it over Charizard? Yes, but I still think it belongs in good Echo Fighter tier, and Charmander is going to do the same. I'll put it like that. These tiers are not really going to be ordered like with most tier lists I make, but I do think it looks visually just better for Charmeleon to be further along. And then for all this kind of stuff, Mega Evolutions and Gigantamaxes and stuff like that, for the most part, I'm not really going to mention them. I'm just going to assume that it's, you know, Final Smash territory, unless I feel differently, which there may be a few like that. I'll do the other Gen 1 starter forms here, which means I might as well just cover the other Gen 1 starters. Wartortle is going to go in good Echo Fighter tier again. It's not as inspirational as Charmeleon, but I do think it's just a nice, solid, slower, but stronger take on Squirtle. Maybe you want to do an Echo Fighter Pokemon trainer, right? So it's still Gen 1, but the starting 3 are shuffled around in their evolutions a bit. That could be kind of cool. Bulbasaur, by its own merits, I think is substantially worse in that kind of role, but on the back of this team-up concept that already exists in Smash, he'll go up there too. Same with Venusaur. Blastoise is the one where that doesn't work. Its physiology is just too different to be an Echo Fighter, so it's got to be its own original creation, and it did make a decent candidate. The cannons are obviously its standout element, but it's got a chunky design and a big shell, kind of a heavyweight zoner thing going on. But the only reason I'm advocating for this Echo Fighter thing that used to be called clones is because they're easy to make. You can get an Echo Fighter character where you couldn't get another fully original character. Blastoise isn't easy to make, so now you're saying, okay, we're gonna put the time and effort in to make a real proper Pokemon Trainer 2.0, but we're still using the original 3, at that point you've lost me. Although, now that I've said that, if we're gonna do this Gen 1 remix thing, the lineup that I think works best is Charmeleon as the middle, Bulbasaur as the little one, so then I guess Blastoise has to be the second evolution. Okay, I'll bundle them together and say, take as much from Squirtle as you can, and it would still be less work overall. I don't feel great about it, but I'm kind of locked in by the concept. Let's get away from Gen 1 and from this expectation I'm setting that everyone might get their own little mini essay here. Basculin? That's a fish. It gets fish tier. So here's the thing about functioning in Smash. You kind of have to be able to walk in the Pokemon games because they want you to be able to walk around with every Pokemon. They just kind of swim through the air, which is a fine enough solution if you need to account for all of them, but for Smash, A, it just wouldn't really look right, and B, if you're not touching the ground, a lot of low-aimed attacks are just going to completely whiff on you. That's not exactly fair. A few Smash characters float and hover, and especially their run animations, and even that can cause issues sometimes. They're pretty cool fish as far as fish Pokemon go. I like the different forms, and Basculegion from Pokemon Legends Arceus, which, by the way, easily one of the best Pokemon games ever made. That one's even cooler, and at the very least a more appropriate size by default, but yeah, they're all fish. The Regis, much more conventional body design, especially the original trio. There is an aggressive lack of personality going on here, though. I definitely wouldn't want any as individual Smash fighters, even if they technically would work okay. What about another Pokemon trainer who actually fights directly on the battlefield, unlike the one we have now who's in the background, and they summon the different Regis for different attacks, kind of like Yugi does in that Shonen Jump game that was hyped up for an hour. You know, your defensive attacks are Steel, because Steel tends to be a defensive typing, and your offensive types bring out Regice. Quick ones come from Regieleki, the electric type. But then you get into what's really the identity of dragons with Regidrago here. What about Regirock? It kind of overlaps with what we already have. I really like this Pokemon trainer concept. I'm probably going to come back to it, but it feels a bit wasted on these guys. I'll give them all B tier because if you package them up, you can create something okay with them. Not my favorite. See, Regigigas though, this one's actually a lot more interesting to me because its signature ability gives it a far stronger standalone gameplay direction. Slow Start halves its attack and speed for the first 5 turns of a game in Pokemon, so I think you could somewhat translate that into Smash as kind of a momentum system where it powers up as the fight goes on. Its signature move is Crush Grip, which would work really well as a command grab, obviously just on the animation alone. Crush Grip in Pokemon is less effective the more damage a Pokemon has already taken, and you could just translate that to be a high damage but low kill power move, but for a little more faithfulness you could say, yeah, it's not a good killing command grab, and it does good damage at all times because Regigigas is a very slow heavy character, but if your opponent hasn't taken much damage, it does outrageous amounts. And for a big slow character who's starting off even slower, you do need to give him an edge of some kind. Then throw in some defense-oriented moves like Wide Guard. It's a normal type, which by definition are often kind of bland and uninteresting. That doesn't really apply here. Yeah, A tier. Wobbuffet. Wobbuffet is a punching bag, and as you're going to see throughout this video, there's a lot of Wobbuffet being beaten up. Its moveset is essentially entirely based around counterattacking, and that's cool. I think it works well in the context of Pokemon. It gives it a very interesting niche, but the thing about Pokemon where you have hundreds of fighters that can fulfill very specific roles like this, not all of them perfectly translate into Smash. Yeah, you could come up with a moveset for Wobbuffet. It smacks you with its head and its arms, and it has multiple counter-style moves still, but no, Wobbuffet as a Pokemon is aggressively designed only around counterattacking, and you need to take away a lot of that faithfulness to translate it, which I don't necessarily want to do. And yes, I know it had a role in the show, and I'm not ignoring that, but it has such a cool gameplay niche that I do value that more. I've done a similar video to this in the past over on my second channel, which wasn't about Pokemon, it was just about random other video game characters, and I penalized them heavily for not having a moveset that would naturally translate over smoothly into Smash, and I always get comments going, what are you talking about? Sakurai took a literal toy robot or a literal duck sitting on a dog and he managed to make coherent movesets for them, even when I clear up my philosophy ahead of time. So I'm going to clarify it here, and I'm coming in very early with a very strong example. Yes, you could design a functional moveset in Smash for Wobbuffet. You could do that with any character, but if there are Pokemon whose natural playstyles lend themselves extremely well to the Smash environment, why am I more interested and therefore giving a higher rank to Pokemon where that doesn't apply? So I'm going to give him a C tier because it's vaguely interesting if nothing else. If I want to do this counter-focused playstyle, there are Pokemon that still have somewhat of a similar emphasis, but fit more naturally, whereas Wobbuffet, you need to break him out of his mold too much. The Unknown, kind of a similar thing again, where there's a group of them, and they're the alphabet. Those are their concepts, and neither of those really translate into Smash very well. In fact, they translate into Smash miserably. I can't even picture like a Pokemon trainer that attacks with just a swarm of Unknown. That sounds functional, but really boring. That's our first just clear-cut F tier, where technically you could make them work if you tried hard enough, but I just don't want to. Let's talk about Grafaiai, one of my favorite Gen 9 Pokemon. As you'll find throughout this video, I'm a sucker for poison types, and poison normal is an interesting typing. Makes sense for a shrew, or at least the evolution of a shrew. Obviously, it's an II now. It's all about attack and speed, though, which creates an interesting juxtaposition because that's not really how poison generally works. When you think poison, you think wear your opponent down over time, right? Whereas this is just like, no, I'm quick and I hit hard with physical attacks. Personally, that's a bit of a problem for me because we already have multiple small, quick Pokemon, so it's up against tough competition, and when you go, no, my gimmick is that, say, I hit you and my attacks do a little bit of damage over time. Okay, cool, but there are other poison Pokemon who have way more distinctive identities than that, and most of what it's otherwise doing is really comparable to stuff that's already in Smash and a lot of stuff that's not. The other thing it has going for it is Doodle, its signature move, which changes its ability to match the ability of its target. That's not the easiest thing to translate into Smash. Obviously, abilities don't exist. Maybe you could make it take on a move. Well, Kirby exists. Maybe it could take on the opponent's stats or something like that. That's not especially interesting. I'm gonna go B tier, and honestly, even a lot of that is being carried by how cool I think this one looks. It's kind of borderline. And you know what? If I was considering slipping him down into C tier, then Wobbuffet is definitely F. As for Shroot, I'll just use the evolution. Hey, why don't we just kick the guest slots off here with Leon Massey, a newcomer to the channel whose A Tale of Two Top Tiers video is, I think, one of the higher quality Smash videos ever put out.
Look at these two sets of stats. These are the same gamer. Could you look at Aegislash and go, that's just gonna be Pokemoth, yes? But consider that you're wrong. Although Aegislash does conjure up ideas of a sword character, what makes the Pokemon interesting is their ability to switch between an offensive and defensive stat line. So my idea is that they have two different forms like old Zelda and Sheik, where attacking makes them go into a faster, aggressive form with a weight class and fall speed that makes them combo food, and whenever they block, they transform into a slower, floatier form. The user then has to manage two different sets of character feel, without being able to permanently sit in one form. Also, Boss has a shield. They could use that for some of their attacks. It doesn't have to all be Fairs and Dolphin Slash or whatever. Two guys in one guy tier.
Yeah, hi, this is me stepping in during editing, so I only asked the guest to provide voiceover, but this is Leon's editing, which is above and beyond. Really appreciate it, turned out great. But because I got it in my head that I wasn't going to be editing this segment, it didn't really occur to me that I still had to film myself placing it in the tier. I'm cheating and doing it way after the fact here. So yeah, I do eventually catch it and add it to the tier list properly, but just use your imagination for a little while. There's no way I can feasibly stitch it into every single clip. Machamp. Now, being a fighting type for a fighting game subgenre is kind of cheating, and that's definitely going to be taken into account, and Machamp is also kind of cheating. It's the most obvious heavyweight grappler character in existence, but it's really obvious because it works really well. Multiple grapple style moves, obviously, and it could use two arms to hold on to someone, and then use the other two to keep hitting around it. So in multiplayer games, it could be like a grappler that grabs onto its victim and like knocks people out of the way as it's carrying them to the ledge, or maybe if there's no other person in its way, it's a pummel while it's walking. Tack on a bunch of your typical hard-hitting close quarters attacks on top of that, particularly punching-based ones. Machamp's getting A tier. You know this would work great, and the only reason it's not the first S tier of the video is because Incineroar exists. And yeah, there's a lot of overlap there in terms of them both being grapplers and even the wrestling theme, so I can't in good conscience say S, but oh my god, it's close. Machop and Machoke get functional Echo Fighter tier because yeah, you could just get rid of a couple of the arms and they'd work technically, maybe with some tweaking, but that just sounds so much worse. I don't know why I want that. You know what, Machoke is going in just use the evolution tier. It offers basically nothing besides the arms thing. At the very least, Machop is small and cute. Instead of taking arms away though, what if we add them? Hoopa. Not a design that you hear talked about a lot, but I think Hoopa is a really cool legendary, and that's coming from someone who actually skipped this generation. Psychic Ghost is such a cool type combination, and Ghost would be something new to this series. It's also possibly my favorite Pokemon type. I just like all the edgy types, I'll be honest. It's got two forms, Hoopa Confined and Hoopa Unbound. They both work, but I don't think you really need to mess around with any form switching stuff. I just think Hoopa Unbound is way more interesting. Use Hyperspace Hole as a teleport behind their back kind of move. Hyperspace Fury also bypasses protection, so it could be a shield break move or be unblockable. Lots of teleport focus overall, and you could have a really cool set of throw animations, throwing people through rings and passing them through portals. Okay, Hoopa Unbound is going to be the first S tier of the video. Hoopa Confined is going to get upstaged tier. There's nothing wrong with it. Totally functional Pokemon. I could see someone else coming up with a moveset that starts out in this form and then it does like a limit break kind of thing to get into this form, or maybe treats this as the final smash. But I think the body type here is just so much more interesting. Speaking of body types, Braviary. That's a bird. It gets bird tier. This is another one of those things where, yes, you could have a flying Pokemon just on the ground and then it flies for some of its moves, but frankly, when I picture this Pokemon, I picture it flying everywhere, and I don't think you can really smoothly translate that into Smash, and I'd rather it maintain that. Pidgeot, same thing again. What, you want it just waddling around on the ground pecking at you? No, you want it flying majestically through the air, but you can't have it flying majestically through the air in Smash. Same with their evolution lines, same with their alternate forms. They're birds. Not perfect terminology, admittedly, because what about Surfetched? It's a bird, but it doesn't really work like that. Okay, these ones get Flappy Bird tier, which goes nicely alongside the Floppy Fish. Let's talk about Surfetched then. I love it. Sword and shield fighter that uses a giant leak. I'm totally on board with that. Love how smug he looks too. Make him an aggro sword fighter. Give him moves like Brave Bird as a burst movement option, or maybe up special. Probably up special, because I think for side special you go Meteor Assault, his signature move. In Pokemon it's extremely powerful, but you can't move during your next turn. So in Smash I think make it a really rewarding burst movement option, one of the strongest in the game, and it's even got pretty good startup, but it's got a ton of end lag on it. The first move that it learns is First Impression, which is really strong, but you can only use it on the first turn you're in battle. Let him do that in Smash, make it maybe his forward smash, and then the first time it connects, or even the first time he uses it, probably just connects. That's a bit less extreme and a bit more Smash-like design. It's extra powerful. He gets A tier. Stays out of S because he doesn't really use the shield all that much in his canonical moveset, which is a bit of a shame. And we have aggro sword fighters in the game already, and I just don't want to hear comments about, oh, another sword fighter got added to Smash. But I like them. I think the Farfetch'd are good Echo Fighters. You would need to change some animations because of the lack of shield, but other than that, basically a Surfetch'd with a shorter sword, smaller and faster, and maybe you need to change the signature moves as well. You know, something like that's starting to get into a lot of changes. Also just really not an interesting downgrade. Okay, more like functional Echo Fighter. Vespiquen. You know, there's kind of an interesting puppet slash swarm command style going on here. Slow and floaty, kind of Rosalina-ish, but then you summon in combis to help you out. Probably not a permanent thing like Luma, more just summon bugs in and then have them move into different positions and do different stuff and sort of assemble and disassemble the swarm as needed. Attack order, obviously, that's used to rush them in. Defense order is used to create some kind of walling effect. That could be like an anti-air attack. They quickly rise into the air as a vertical line. Give her some kind of projectile with the combis where they home in on the target, and then if you connect Sweet Scent first, they can home in way more effectively. That's a strong A tier bordering S. Then Combi just used the evolution, although it is technically showing up. So now we get to another new body type, the quadruped. We have two of these in Smash already. One of them's a Pokemon, and Ivysaur is a pretty ideal candidate for it. Because yes, it is an unconventional shape, but it's got a very big head that works well for different attacks, and it's got the bulb on its back, which gives it something else to do. By far the most substantial though, it can spawn vines whenever it needs them, and it ends up doing that quite a lot because quadrupeds do have some inherent limitations they need to work around. Houndoom doesn't really have the same luxury. He's more or less just stuck with his body, and it's a pretty good shape for it. He's got claws that he can slash with, he's got a mouthful of sharp teeth, he's got the horns. Can't really do a whole lot with his skinny tail though. And Fire Dark is a type that's already taken by Incineroar. So we're working with a lot of issues here. That said, Houndoom is also my favorite Pokemon, so... Oh, I'm sorry, did you think this video was going to be objective? Yeah, Houndoom gets first crack at the interesting moves. Neutral special, Fire Blast. The move that Charizard has reserved for a final smash, Houndoom just gets to do that. Side special burst option is Flame Charge. Now, in Pokemon, it powers your speed up if it connects. So in Smash, we're translating that as if it whiffs, it's got a decent amount of end lag, but if it connects on an opponent, you can act out of it essentially instantly while still maintaining forward momentum. It turns into an incredible combo starter. Up special, that's Heat Wave, a blast of hot air rises up around Houndoom and pushes him into the sky. And then down special, because this is a dog, is Odor Sleuth. It's your pretty typical bite attack that's just okay, but it can hit opponents who are spot dodging, rolling, or air dodging, and if it does bonus damage. I wasn't allowed to have video games in the house until way past Gold and Silver's heyday, and all I wanted to do was battle with the same Houndoom that I saw my friends using on their Game Boy Link cables, and now that I'm a grown-ass adult, I can do what I want, including put it at the top of my tier list above characters that definitely deserve it more. Okay, now to talk about a more objectively worthy quadruped, PJiggles, what you got?
Hey everyone, PJiggles here. With my channel icon and name being based on a Pokemon, you might be surprised to hear that I don't really like the Pokemon franchise, but a character from that series I'd love to see in Smash would be Zacian, the box art legendary from Pokemon Sword that, as you would expect, wields a giant sword in its mouth. I honestly don't really care how Zacian would play or what its gimmicks would be, but the idea of essentially a dog that wields a sword in its mouth is hilarious. Reminds me of the great grey wolf Sif from Dark Souls 1, which is literally a giant wolf with a sword in its mouth. You can probably look at that fight and think of some ways Zacian would attack in Smash. I'm sure they could build an interesting moveset around this Pokemon, but considering Generation 8, which Zacian is from, has since passed, I'm not sure how likely this one will be when we get a new Smash game. Still, I'm gonna give it an S tier for Sword. Sword tier. Yeah, you get it.
Then I'll talk about Zamazenta. I like it. I like it more than Zacian. I've seen the pictures. I've seen Zacian break multiple mediums of competitive play. I know how the world treats Zamazenta, but I think a wolf enveloped in this regal shield that looks like a lion's mane is one of the sickest legendary designs they've ever come up with. Yes, fighting steel overlaps with Lucario pretty heavily, but there's so much of a difference in moveset potential here. Zamazenta would have a lot of counter and armor moves, Behemoth Bash would just hit like a truck. If Zacian's going in S tier, Zamazenta's going in S tier too. It's been trod on enough, and I might as well just get all of the spite picks out of the way now. Mr. Mime. I think this is one of the weirdest, most unpleasant designs they've ever come up with for a Pokemon. It's like they hadn't really refined the idea of exactly what a Pokemon is yet. Horrifying to look at, the Mr. prefix causes some weird implications with how these animals are treated. Don't like it as a Pokemon at all, but goddamn if it couldn't have some fun animations in a fighting game. Put those weird, jerky movesets where it's pretending to do stuff into play, have it actually make a wall, have it actually, I don't know, ride a car, whatever it is mimes do. You could really have it mime essentially any action and it would have a lot of charm to it. I think Hatred and Intrigue balance out to B tier here. Same tier for the Galarian form, it's a similar deal plus ice. Mime Jr. is theoretically a good Echo Fighter, except its body type just isn't really as well suited to it, so I guess that moves it down to functional Echo Fighter. But even lore-wise, it evolves into Mr. Mime after it learns the move Mimic. So Mime Jr. canonically is just not a very good mime. Yeah, just use the evolution on that one. And then Mr. Rhyme isn't as offensive to look at to me as Mr. Mime is. It also loses some of the charm though. It's based on Charlie Chaplin, which is kind of a cool source of inspiration, but it's not as interesting from an animation perspective as the mime is, or at least the full mime is. So I think it actually gets put below Mr. Mime. The original is still the one I'd most advocate for here. It's the purest vision. Just use the evolution tier doesn't quite cover this anymore. There. That ought to catch it. Spearow and Fearow are flappy birds. You know, Fearow has a little bit more going on. Seems to be kind of inspired by water birds, which do spend more of their time standing, but even then, it's got massive wings on it. It really would be restricted if it couldn't make full use of those. Another weird body shape, bats. They're not quite birds, but they are kind of birds. Okay, here's what I think is every bat Pokemon. I don't think they need their own tier. I'm just putting the Zubat, Golbat, Crobat line in Flappy Bird tier because that's really fundamentally what they are. I really like Crobat. I think it's an amazing design overall, but it doesn't really fit here. What the hell are these? Woobat and Swoobat. I never played Gen 5. I know it has a reputation for just creating a lot of knockoffs of existing Pokemon. This has to be among the worst though, right? Not only are they really redundant, but they're so much worse. I hate these. New tier. You know what? Just take them out of Pokemon as well. Gligar and Gliscor work better. These are actually part ground type, and you do see them standing up on two legs in official artwork. Pincers are cool. Scorpion Tail is cool. I think we are going to see Pokemon that make better use of pincers and better use of Scorpion Tails and better use of wings, even taking away the pure flyers. It is kind of interesting how it fits them all together though. Yeah, B tier. I'm sure there's something you could do with that. Lunala honestly has the same issue where it really only belongs in the sky. It goes in the same tier as those bats. Okay, Flappy Bird really doesn't work anymore. Flappy Wings, let's do that. Noibat isn't really much of anything. Noivern though. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. It's a dragon type and partially based on a wyvern with the hand wings, so I could actually see this one moving around on the ground pretty comfortably and then using gliding style moves. Maybe it has a built-in glide, kind of like Brawl characters used to have. Maybe it has a really good gliding side special or up special, multiple jumps. Make this one King of the Bat Pokemon. Use those huge wings and then give it a lot of sound style moves, give it some biting moves. Yeah, okay, I actually really like Noivern. This is going to be A tier. And Noibat, I guess, is like a functional Echo Fighter. Solgaleo, Lunala's counterpart, does a much better job. This one actually fits in as a quadruped pretty comfortably. I don't love the idea of these paired box legendaries getting one but not the other though. Yeah, this is like a C tier. You could have it work as a pretty functional Pokemon on its own and then have Lunala come in for the final smash or something like that. Doesn't seem that satisfying though. Cosmog, Cosmoem, those are gonna go and just use the evolution, which doesn't even really work that well for Solgaleo, so I think, yeah, more like that. You know where I think this paired legendary concept works a lot better? Reshiram and Zekrom. By their own merits, not nearly so much. They're functional Pokemon, particularly Zekrom, but they're a bit busy, and the main appeal of this kind of thing is fusing with Kyurem, which by itself is even worse. It looks incomplete, but then you can use the DNA splicer to get Kyurem white and Kyurem black. And frankly, both these designs are also a little bit busy and kind of big, and you'd need to scale them down maybe a bit more than would necessarily fit in the Smash perfectly. But there is definitely something going on there where you could have both of them on the same character, a switching mechanic maybe, and Kyurem Kyurem White is more focused on special attacks and Kyurem Black is more physical. For Smash, I think you would probably interpret that as Kyurem White is more of a distance character, Kyurem Black is melee. I'm probably gonna have to do that a lot throughout this video. A switching mechanic that works like that is just kind of awkward though, because it's like if you're further away, you switch to the long range one. If you're not, you switch to the close range one. It's pretty obvious. They both hit like a truck, so there's not really much of a Zelda Sheik dynamic you could do. I'm not willing to say I love the Kyurems, but there's something there. Then the others just use the evolution. And then the way the tiers work now, I think Huba can just come down. The Voltorb line, yeah, it just doesn't work, I'm sorry. Having literal just spheres roll around is a fun design exercise, I guess, but they're not real actual candidates. The one thing I could say is you could have them kind of doing a stand-up thing where they manifest electricity around themselves kind of like a body. That's the kind of thing that can exist in the Pokemon world, technically, but it would feel very out of place on them. F is too harsh, though. I mean, it's not, but it is. You know what I mean? Comedy tier. That's where I'm putting all the Diglett and Dugtrio stuff, too, because no. But if you want them, I respect it. Same with Execute. I'm not even going to stoop to just use the evolution, because if you can make a bunch of eggs fight, I want to see it. Executor does need to be considered a bit more. It has no arms though, and I know it's got multiple heads, which is kind of interesting from a design perspective, but you can't really do much attacking with them. It is a psychic type, so if you wanted, you could have it like disconnect its heads and use them for bashing. I don't think it can do that in lore. I don't want to see it if it can. This is just a C tier. You could technically make it work with the psychic theming. It can manifest arms or whatever, like arms out of the air, but why? I'm putting comedy above C tier. Screw it. At least they bring something to the table, especially when a Alolan Executor exists, because out of the two of them, yeah, obviously the base Executor would fit into Smash better as a character, but there's a reason the funny long-necked dragon form got the Pokeball slot. Pit of an Unpheasant and what are you? Tranquil. I had to look it up. Middle evolutions, am I right? In any case, they're all flappy wings. Pretty bland as far as regional birds go too. Another Gen 5 bird, Ducklet. And listen, I know that since the beginning, Pokemon's been kind of guilty of just putting straight up animals in the game and calling them animals, but I have a real visceral hatred for this one. It's so blatant. You know what? Just take him out of Pokemon as well. Swanna at least avoids that fate. There is a little bit of an ugly duckling to swan thing going on. It is a theme, but this isn't even really set up to be an ugly duckling. Just kind of goofy looking. Gen 5's not having a good day so far. Let's crap on one that I grew up with. Jinx was a mistake, even if it didn't come with some aged implications. It's just a hideously ugly Pokemon, which is actually really not helping. Smoochum isn't nearly as bad, but I am punishing it for its future crimes. Oh, I forgot about Houndour. Yeah, it's a functional Echo Fighter, but Speaking of Echo Fighters, we got two here. We got Raichu and Alolan Raichu, and I think they would both make great Echo Fighters of Pikachu. Really just depends on the direction you want to take. Base Raichu is a relatively simple, slower, stronger transformation, whereas Alolan Raichu, you need to change the running animation and probably a couple other ones and give it a psychic move or two to build the theme out. So it really just depends on how much time the team has. Do we need the entire Pikachu evolution line in Smash? No, but if any Pokemon's gonna get it, it's definitely gonna be that one. And yeah, they're all good. Tinkaton. I really like this one. She was on my team for Scarlet. Fairy Steel is such a cool typing, and I love the small pixie-ish character with a gigantic hammer. Really lightweight, agile mobility, but with the frame data of a heavy and a massive disjoint to compensate. That could be cool territory. You know you're putting Gigaton Hammer in there as a forward smash, like a Ganondorf-style massive overhead swing. I say like Ganondorf instead of King DDD because I want it to be better than DDD's, although keep some of that shockwave aspect. It's got good fairy moves like Play Rough and Draining Kiss, which steals health, and then it's also got Pickpocket as a hidden ability, which lets it steal stuff. So I think definitely have some kind of health or power drain aspect in there. Maybe let it have some good moves that are very fast, but are just miserably stubby. And then the power moves are again more like heavyweight frame data. There's actually so much there. This is S tier. I was considering saying functional Echo Fighter for the other two, but I think it's more like just use the evolution. The entire appeal of Tinkaton is the juxtaposition between very small and light and then big and hard hitting. So keep the small and light angle, but then make the hard hitting part less hard hitting. It's not really clicking. Trevenant and Gourgeist are an interesting pair. Trevenant has Forest Curse, which sticks to your opponent and turns them into a grass type, and then Gourgeist does the same thing with Trick or Treat to turn them into a ghost type. Forest Curse is the one that makes more sense to me because I can absolutely see the more you landed on them, the more they grow grass, and then Trevenant also has some moves that are super effective against grass. Not all of its moves are, but I think it would actually be pretty cool for Pokemon in Smash to pay more attention to exactly what type of move they're using. Bring some of the type matchup system into Smash with them. This is technically basically been tried already with Pokemon Trainer, except it was just done really badly, and in Ultimate they rightfully took it out. But if you can inflict a type on your opponent and then have some moves on your kit set up to take advantage of it, that's pretty good. It's like a selectively powered Inkling mechanic. The unfortunate part of this is that canonically Trevenant doesn't actually have that many moves that are super effective on grass. It has some, but they're not really that big a part of its kit. Gourgeist is better set up in a 1 versus 1 scenario in that regard because it turns the opponent into a ghost type, and ghost moves are super effective on ghost types. If you translate it into Smash though, that's not really as mechanically interesting. I like the concept of Trevenant having to go out of its way a little bit to capitalize on grass. And also the concept of making your opponent progressively grassier just seems a little more sensible than progressively ghostier. What do? You coat them in some kind of aura, or you make them sort of fade into the background, make them partially translucent. Grass seems way more readable, and Trevenant also has a much better body shape. Trevenant's gonna get A tier. I don't think I'm gonna go S tier because I doubt this is gonna be the only time in the video I come back to that selective move typing thing. Phantompus just used the evolution, so's Pumpkaboo, and then for Gourgeist, I'm gonna bring back the upstaged tier. I think you definitely go Trevenant. And while we're talking about Nightmare Fuel, here's Waidu covering Shuckle.
You might think Shuckle wouldn't fit in Smash, but hear me out. You can't ignore the annoying gimmick characters that exist to make people really mad. That's a whole playstyle, and you know what it's time for, folks. It's time for entry hazards in Smash. Make Shuckle heavy, slow, and weak. But if he gets you to the ledge, you become like Sisyphus, climbing through Stealth Rock and Sticky Web and Infestation, only to get slapped back off stage with one of his disjointed noodle leg aerials. And then, you die at 80, cause he used Power Trick. So yeah, Shuckle would be unconventional, but look at Piranha Plant. Evil little ledge trap creature is a perfectly valid archetype in Smash, and for that reason, I rank Shuckle B tier.
Darmanitan. So this is known in Pokemon as being just an all-out aggro fire attacker, which there's really no shortage of, and the same thing applies to its ice-type Galarian form. Ice is blatantly set up to be an offensive type. We're going to be looking at plenty of that today. Not too interesting, even if their body shapes are pretty well set up for a fighting game. The interesting part of these characters is their Zen mode, though. If their health drops under half, they get a Zen mode where they gain the psychic typing and have some stats shuffled around, which is a really cool mechanic, even if it's not particularly good competitively or anything. I don't care about that. What I do care about is the Zen forms are essentially just immobile, which does not translate to a fighting game particularly well at all. The Snowman form of the Galarian version is a nice touch, but ultimately it's the same thing. So if the thing that really makes them stand out is something that can't really be translated into Smash particularly well, I gotta go C tier. I'll put the Zen modes up here too, because that is ultimately what's bringing them down. And then Darumaka's just used the evolution. Feebas is just a floppy fish. Milotic though, this is the first serpent or snake design we've looked at so far. I don't really know what to do about this. I'm starting off with one where I just love Melodic's design. It's one of my favorite Gen 3 Pokemon, which is my first Pokemon generation that I was allowed to play, so that's saying a lot. Some heavy nostalgia value attached there. I don't think they work that well, and that's painful to say. Milotic is better than some, though. It gets to hold itself upright, and it gets to use that long protrusion on the end of its tail, those fins or the fan, bring that over its quote-unquote shoulder to attack with. You know, it's not awful. For jumps, it can augment them with water under its body, kind of like it's pressurizing itself up. Its main trait is being special defensive. That's honestly kind of hard to translate to the Smash environment. You just make it pretty tough overall. It also has quite good special attack though, and that makes a lot of sense with water moves. I think Hydrokinesis is kind of going to be the theme here. You know what, I'm going to go B tier because if nothing else, it's really interesting, and this sea serpentish design is definitely more versatile than a lot of snakes. Can't really say the same for Ekans, the snakiest snake that ever snaked. Arbok is based on a cobra, which means it also stays really upright. Definitely can't achieve anywhere near as much as Melodic can, but I think if you were going for a design challenge, you could kind of make Arbok work. Don't even try with Ekans, though. I'm not calling that a proper Echo Fighter. Okay, first up, what's probably going to be many new recording days I'm coming back to for this. I was talking about Gen 3 nostalgia. Let's do the Gen 3 starters here. I think these are all great. I know I'm fighting against a lot of bias, but I still think this may be the overall strongest line of starters, at least in their final forms. The most obvious one is Blaziken. You know, it's the fighting type. That's kind of what you come to expect. It shows up in a lot of stuff like Pokken, for example. It's clearly got a body shape very well set up for Smash. Lots of kicks and lots of aggro fire moves. It kind of writes itself. Because of that, it's kind of boring though. I think the far more interesting pick is Sceptile. Still a great body shape that can actually do more because of the leaf blades on its arms and then that giant tail. And while yeah, you obviously put powerful, iconic grass type moves on it, one thing that I'd actually really like to see it get is False Swipe, because it learns that in Ruby and Sapphire, and I get the impression that for essentially everyone who chose Trico as their starter, Sceptile was their False Swiper. To this day is one of the Pokemon I most associate with the role, and False Swipe in Pokemon can never kill, so in Smash it would be cool cool if it was an extremely powerful move, like ridiculously powerful, but your opponent always abruptly stopped moving just a bit short of the blast zone, so you could put them in a very disadvantageous position really easily, but it would never actually finish them off. Make the rest of its stats, its hitboxes and frame data just fantastic, so it's a big part of its game plan, but then it needs to go out there to finish the opponent off. That would be a cool playstyle. And then Swampert, I think, also works really well. Water ground is an interesting typing. I could picture it having a very low grounded playstyle. A lot of attacks that used its arms or its big head with the fins on it. And then also a lot of mud-based attacks, of course, which we don't really have in Smash right now. That could be cool. Blaziken, I feel like I have no choice but to give S tier. Yeah, it's very comparable to Machamp, including the fighting type overlap and the fire type overlap, but it's just set up to be in Smash. It's so obvious. Sceptile, another easy S tier, and if I had any intention of putting more than one Pokemon in S+, that would be where it went, especially because Pokemon Sapphire was my first game, and I went with Trico. And then Swampert, while I think it would work pretty well too, it doesn't lend itself nearly as obviously to the Smash environment. I can definitely see it doing like scooping attacks with its head fins, which is actually pretty well in line with the ground theme. I could see it doing like bulldozing kind of attacks. Okay, you know what? Screw it. Let's complete the trifecta. Trico, I think, is a functional Echo Fighter. The big difference is it doesn't have those leaf blades on its arms, which is not an especially interesting thing to take away. Grovyle technically works better, but I'm just going to put it in functional Echo Fighter as well, because who wants the middle evolution? Torchic just used the evolution. Its body shape doesn't really work. Combusken doesn't really work either. It's closer. Its legs are still kind of stubby though, and I also just think it's a pretty ugly design overall. Not my favorite middle evolution. Marshchomp's going and just use the evolution tier as well, because I know you all want Mudkip, and in all honesty, it is actually the most functional Echo Fighter of any of these. Smeargle is interesting because the whole concept of this one is it's the Pokemon that can learn anything. So the direction for its moveset is pretty obvious. Every single attack it has is a different canonical Pokemon move with wildly different source material, and then maybe sprinkle in a couple moves that use its paintbrush tail, but really I just want to see a whole lot of different move representation. That's neat. The question for me is, does so much different gameplay direction result in no gameplay direction? And I could kind of see a case for that, but at the very least, it's certainly a very striking design, and there's a lot of possibilities there. You know, I'm going to go S tier for it, because of all the Pokemon that come to mind that do that huge move pull inspiration, its body shape I think is the one that pulls it off the best. Mew, for example, right, is kind of in a rough spot. Canonically, Mewtwo is a clone of it, so it would be sort of cool to see it as an Echo Fighter, but Mew's whole gimmick is that it can learn basically any move, so it would be really disappointing to just see it use the same psychic inspiration as Mewtwo, and also its body shape isn't really as well set up to use all the physical attacks Mewtwo does. You could make it work, but would it be ideal? No, so I think you sort of have to make it its own character. And if we're doing that, I think Smeargle does it better. It's bigger, it can walk more normally, it has a body type better suited for fighting games. Mew is too small and frail looking, and even though it could hover sort of like Mewtwo does, I think it would just look more awkward in comparison. Mew is going in upstage tier. I'd rather see Smeargle. Talonflame. I think this is one of the cooler regional bird designs they've come up with. I love it. I love how it plays in Pokemon, but it's flappy wings, no one's safe, along with the earlier stages. Fun fact, Crustle is the first shiny Pokemon I ever found, so that's something. Crustle's a goofball, comedy tier. Dwebble, Conkeldurr. So this is a slow, heavy dual sword fighter. Wait a minute. This is Clown Ganondorf. Wait, this actually kind of kicks ass. Give it a lot of really heavy, powerful attacks with those stone pillars, and then it learns Fling, so let it just use that to throw one of them at you. I know Fling is supposed to throw an item in Pokemon, but whatever, you'll work with what you got. Maybe let it use Bulk Up to give itself a power boost. I'm really feeling this, actually. Okay, this is getting S tier. It checks so many boxes for me. Do these guys work as Echo Fighters? I'm gonna say no. It's one object instead of two. You need to change them too much. Cramorant is another bird, and this is one that does stay on the ground or in the water more, and spends all its time spitting up fish as projectiles. Comedy. You know what? I'll give it up for Pelipper as well. Concept's in the same ballpark, and this is at least one flying bird where I could see it waddling around on the ground being vaguely reasonable. No such concession for Wingull, though. This is just a seagull. Speaking of boring Gen 3 birds, Tailo and Swellow. Yeah, really not much going on there. Again, they're just kind of birds. Wait, did I forget about Lucario when already in Smash this entire time? No, I didn't. You saw nothing. Riolu is actually a perfectly good Echo Fighter, though. Doesn't have the spikes on the back of its hands like Lucario does, but that's okay. They make some appearances in Lucario's Smash moveset, but it's pretty minimal. Flamigo. So as far as bird Pokemon go, this one's more compatible than a lot of them. It's flying fighting type, and it doesn't really actually spend a lot of its time flying, much more fighting. You could actually kind of make this one work. You'd really have to force it, and the moveset isn't particularly inspired. Realistically, realistically, this is way more of like a C tier or below, but I like Flamingo. It's getting the full bias bump up to B. Scovillain's kind of interesting. I like the design, 2 heads, there's definitely some moveset potential there. The concept of a spicy pepper Pokemon is fun, and it's split grass fire type, so there's definitely some interesting stuff you could do there. I'm basically always going to advocate for grass types. Its signature move is Spicy Extract, which ups the target's attack but lowers its defense. That could have some interesting implications in Smash. Hit your opponent with it and they get a power boost, but they're also really easy to send flying. Or maybe it could just be an extremely powerful attack, like outrageously powerful, but if it doesn't kill your opponent, yeah, they get a power boost for a bit. I think the more straight up just buff debuff aspect does make more sense based on the source material though. Yeah, there's actually a lot here, A tier. Capsakid's kind of a nothing Pokemon with 1 head though, so whatever. Gen 9s that I'm not such a fan of though, Pawmi, Pawmo, Pawmot, these are all the same thing. I have no idea why this is a 3-stage evolution. Such a lazy design, just get them out of Pokemon as well, they're so unnecessary. Electric Fighting is theoretically kind of a cool type if it was attached to a more interesting design, but even in that case, we have fighting Pokemon in Smash, and we definitely have electric rodents in Smash. Another kind of nothing evolution, Poliwhirl to Poliwrath. Now, Poliwrath is a perfectly functional Pokemon, but it's just not that interesting. Fighting and water type, whatever, those both exist already, and it doesn't really have that much of a gameplay direction to it. Politoed, the other thing that Poliwhirl was given to evolve into later, you know, that's more interesting. It at least has a distinct look and definitely more of a gameplay direction. It's a rain setter. I think weather Pokemon in general, though, while they serve very cool functions in Pokemon, are going to be a bit of a tough sell in Smash for the most part. Weather just isn't really a mechanic in the Smash series, and I don't think it should be. What are you going to do, have rain falling on the entire stage the entire time? No, that's just kind of dumb and horrible for visibility. The alternative is maybe having a rain cloud just spawn directly over Politoed and follow it around. Yeah, it sounds kind of forced and not totally within the spirit of what you're doing. The entire point of weather effects in Pokemon is they transform the entire stage. I'm going to put it in weather doesn't work tier, and I'm a bit hesitant to make this. I may end up getting rid of it because there's going to be a lot of debate about exactly what counts as a weather-focused Pokemon. They really went ham with it for a few years, and you get into terrain and stuff like that too, but we'll start with it. Poliwrath, like I said, perfectly fine Pokemon, but just really boring. Poliwhirl is technically a great Echo Fighter because it's the same Pokemon, but whatever. Don't use Poliwrath, and if you have to, definitely don't give us 2 of them. Castform, this is a great example of what I'm talking about. Castform's entire thing, like, all it does is changing along with the weather. And you could translate that to just being kind of an elemental user, but again, you're taking away the core spirit of the Pokemon, and his body shape just doesn't really work on top of that. It's sitting on clouds, has to hover off the ground, it's way too small. It's getting weather doesn't work, and honestly, this is more just like a straight up F tier, but if they're not going in the weather tier, who is? We're getting into it already. Go-Goat. Grass Quadruped is kind of a tough sell considering that we already have Ivysaur in the game, and on top of that, it's a little bit of a one-trick pony. One-trick goat. It headbutts you. It's a C tier, and Skiddo would work technically, but why? Speaking of quadrupedal one-tricks, we have Tauros. This is just even more of a straight-up charge in and do one thing kind of Pokemon than Go-Goat is. The basic one is a normal type. It brings essentially nothing to the table besides its body attacks, which are functional. It's got hooves and it's got horns, but whatever. The Paldean Tauros in its base form is at the very least a fighting type, like Tauros probably should have been since the beginning, but even that one is kind of the same thing. Yes, you can breed it into fire versions or water versions, so they're at least a little bit more fleshed out, but again, Smash is not suffering from a lack of fire or water Pokemon, and if we're going to add more, there are way more interesting ones than any of these. C tier for all of them. I could sort of see this maybe working in like a Pokken sequel, but for Smash, there's just so much more interesting material to pull from. I talked about Castform floating on a cloud. The Jin legendaries kind of do the same thing. These are interesting. There's 3 in the core group, and each of them have alternate forms. A lot of awkward stuff going on with the body shapes. You might want to incorporate all 3 of them into a moveset, like a Pokemon trainer design somehow, but that's potentially difficult to do because their forms just don't really fit into Smash that well. I don't think they can stick to the floating clouds as their base form for any part of it. It just doesn't work in Smash. What are you going to do? Have the clouds just floating like a ½ inch off the ground? That would look ridiculous. So you have to go for their secondary forms. Tornadus, I don't think that one translates into Smash at all. Landorus is a bit better, but I think by far the best fit from a body design perspective is Thundurus. It's got clouds around its hand, and having it float across the stage with its feet kind of scraping along the ground, that actually makes sense. So if you really want to have the Jin represented as just like a conventional fighter, I think what you do is choose Thundurus Therian as the base form, and most of the attacks are done like that, and then it can switch into its incarnate cloud floating form for different special moves and stuff like that, and mobility options, even while it's jumping and rolling and air dodging. And then if you want to include the other 3, bring them in for the final Smash. And then I say the other 3 because Unfortunately, Enamorus is here too. What a gross, garish thing to insert into this. It's the love-hate Pokemon, which doesn't match with the forces of nature theme that the others have going at all, and I just hate how it looks. I'll put Thundurus at the front, but the entire core gang in B tier, because obviously you're going to include all of them somehow, and even if you don't want to go with that, use this as the lead concept, there's something you could do. And you might say, well, you're forced to include Eternatus in there as well. It's my list, I'm not forced to do anything. They already had a perfectly fine thing going on. You didn't need to drunkenly stumble in and crash the party like that. On the topic of which, Bouffalant. The sheer audacity to make Tauros again. Oh, but it's got more hair now. What, you want credit for that? It's just Tauros with a Pokemon Unite skin. Mimikyu. You know, I love this design. It's such a fan favorite for modern Pokemon games, and I completely get on board with it. It's got a really cool ability with its disguise blocking the first attack. The concept of an eldritch abomination that disguises itself as Pikachu because it wants people to like it. That's so cool. But that ability is its core gimmick, and I just don't think it really translates to Smash super well. Would be kind of awkward to move around with. You could have arms coming out from underneath it to do more stuff. That is something that happens in the Pokemon games. There is something of a gameplay direction here, but it's so clearly defined by its disguise ability, and I kind of want to leave that intact, and I just don't really think you can and bring it into Smash properly. I'll put it in C tier because I really love it as a Pokemon, and there is some stuff there, but honestly, it's kind of close to F. Beedrill, another Pokemon design I love that I think would work a lot better, but I'm gonna have Big Yellow talk about it. They're a channel that does a lot of coverage of competitive Pokemon and competitive fighting games, so basically I've been trying to have them on for a while.
Beedrill's a Pokemon that pretty much everyone knows, but people don't really think a whole lot of, and because of that, I think it would be really funny if they made Beedrill a character that starts off pretty unassuming, and once they have all their stuff set up, is just like the most obnoxious character in the world. Basically, make Beedrill a set play zoner is what I'm getting at. I'm thinking pretty average mobility, pretty average weight, pretty big hurt box, not very good recovery. Maybe make their up be something like Fell Stinger, doesn't go very far, but it's a powerful finisher. But give Beedrill the P+ Ganon Hover. That would be cool, I would like that. Make Neutral Beast something like Toxic Spikes. You put a little toxic cloud on the ground maybe. If they're standing on it, they take high damage over time. But even once they get off it, they're like poisoned for a couple seconds and they take low damage over time. And then Side B can be like a basic projectile, like Poison Sting, the basic ass projectile, but if you hit them while they're poisoned, I don't know, maybe that like enhances it. Maybe it hits twice, right? There's a second hit, like Testament, Stain State, and Strive. Maybe on hit, it launches them towards Beedrill, and on shield, it just makes you Mega Plus. That'd be kind of fun. For Down B shouldn't even be a Pokemon move. Down B should just be you birth a Weedle. Beedrill's a summoner now, and Beedrill just wanders about the stage doing its thing, and if the opponent gets in proximity of it, then it attacks, right? So like if Weedle is nearby, you could like launch the opponent into them and Weedle knocks them up and then you combo off the Weedle, or like you could use it to make your normal safe. Make Beedrill a really technical character for no reason. I think that would be very funny. That's what I'm getting at.
So I guess that means I gotta put Weedle in the same tier, and Kakuna does absolutely nothing. Along with Metapod, that's a lot of hardened spamming. How dare you put Caterpie in my Metapod fighting game? Now Butterfree, the actual candidate, I've got so much nostalgia attached to Butterfree. The first episode of Pokemon I ever saw featured it, but it's Flappy Wings. It doesn't work. I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot why not. Yeah, if you're not going to choose the funny punching bag Pokemon, I don't know why you're going to choose the funny not punching bag Pokemon. Better Echo Fighter territory though. We've got Igglybuff, Wigglytuff, and Screamtail. I don't think Igglybuff really works as a Jigglypuff Echo Fighter just on the back of Jigglypuff already being very small and light. Why do you want more of that? The other two, though, are actually pretty good. Wigglytuff isn't as naturally balloon-shaped, but it does still puff up the same way that Jigglypuff does, so a sort of slower, heavier, blimpier version does work. And then Screamtail is essentially just a strict upgrade on Jigglypuff. It has a stat boost because of its ability Photosynthesis, and it's got a long tail on it, or hair that kind of forms a tail. Obviously, being a strict upgrade over Jigglypuff doesn't really work. You would need to tone it down for Smash, but it's not like we haven't seen that before. Pichu canonically is just supposed to be worse Pikachu, and yet it was a dominant character in Ultimate's early meta before it got nerfed. Its direction isn't nearly as straightforward as Wigglytuff, and it's also a Psychic type, so you would need to give it at least 1 or 2 Psychic type moves to fit the theme as well. You know what I think could be a cool way to go with it? The way Photosynthesis works is if it's holding the booster energy item, which it would, even if it wouldn't appear on the model, it boosts the Pokemon's highest stat by 30% unless it's speed, in which case it's a boost of 50%, so let's emphasize that. And I say you interpret that as Screamtail being way faster on the ground, but way slower in the air. and having fewer jumps. Then it can have some longer ranged, particularly ground attacks with its tail as well, because Jigglypuff is almost entirely defined by air mobility. Taking that away means you need to add some pretty substantial balancing factors elsewhere. I think there's something to that. Both of these get good Echo Fighter. Stoutland. He'd have the Pokemon victory theme, except played on bagpipes. That's pretty much all he does, but it's good enough for me. And yeah, just use him, although Herdier actually has a pretty good middle evolution. Stantler is just a deer, but with Pokemon Legends Arceus letting it evolve into Wordier, we have something to work with here. It's a psychic deer. Obviously already half a shape to work with, the antlers, and then you throw on Psyshield Bash, this defensive psychic move, make it an armored burst movement option. That one's easy. And because to some extent Wordier is one of the faces of Pokemon Legends Arceus, I think it would be a cool candidate for the strong and agile styles that game introduced. Maybe make it like the Street Fighter characters where you can do tapped and held versions of its moves, maybe even all its moves. I think B tier, it's got some strengths, but it doesn't really bring that much to the table besides its own home series mechanic, which is obviously not the only Pokemon that applies to, and deer just have some limitations as a quadruped design. There's only so much you can do, not bad though. Then Stantler, yeah, it's a deer. Sawsbuck is also a deer, and this time it's just a deer. Wait, is this Gen 5 again? Yes, it's Gen 5 again. Why do they keep doing that? And for the record, even though I haven't personally played Gen 5, I know it's the one that forced you to use all new Pokemon until you get to the post game, which I actually respect, but that respect goes down a lot when the new designs just retread the old ones. The seasonal design is at least a gimmick. I don't think it's a particularly good one, and it is definitely one that doesn't translate into Smash particularly well. Honestly, F tier. If you're gonna go with a deer design, they're so far behind Wordier, it's not even funny. Maybe if they're your all-time favorite Pokemon, and statistically someone watching this video would probably say that, you could make an argument for being able to choose the season they're gonna use ahead of time or something like that. Pick it from the character select screen. That's a really interesting mechanic, but give it to who? Them? No, I'll tell you what you do. You give it to Genesect. Genesect's signature move is Technoblast, and it changes typing depending on which elemental drive he enters battle with. So at the character select screen in Smash, you choose a drive for him to equip. Think of it like choosing a Mii loadout or a Smash 4 custom moveset. And its neutral special is Technoblast, and that obviously changes heavily depending on the drive equipped, but then it could also have a couple of other moves. It's Jab and a few Smash attacks and things like that that also use the cannon, and their properties get changed depending on which drive you enter battle with as well. Hold the Shock drive and it gains some paralyzing moves, Chill drive and it can freeze, Burn drive does more damage, Douse drive has more kill power, and they have different hitboxes and frame data, and maybe you can opt not to enter into battle with any drive, in which case you get sort of the most balanced approach. And then plenty of its moveset stays intact across all drives, just like the real Genesect does. Its download ability could be used as a counter, it could use Magnet Rise as a recovery option. S tier, I think Genesect is great. Alcremie. Its identity in Pokemon is shooting missiles made of hardened cream at people. In-game playstyle wise, its only standout stat is special defense. Like I said, that's kind of a hard thing to translate. It comes in a bunch of different flavors, so it would have some pretty sweet costumes, I'll give it up, but you know, hopefully I'm getting a bit more than that with my Smash character. Weird shape and size, its signature move Decorate is just a basic stat boost. Its Gigantamax form on the Giant Tower of Cake is kind of interesting, but some Mega Evolutions may translate properly into just core Smash movesets. I really don't think the Gigantamaxes do at all. I'm willing to do some scaling for Smash, but I'm not willing to go that far. Yeah, this is like a C tier. Cake Decorating is a theme that you could work with, but I don't think it's a particularly compelling one, and then Milcery has just used the evolution. You know what Pokemon I think you just leave in the Mega Evolution form? Mile. It could walk and run and jump backwards, so it fights with those giant mouths facing you, and the major difference between its base form and its evolution is just that it gets two mouths, which, as I've already gone over, I think gives way more room for moveset potential. It's called the Deceiver Pokemon because the whole point behind it is it looks cute and innocent and then turns around and it has the giant jaws, which obviously doesn't perfectly translate into Smash, but it's just entering battle already angry. Compared to exclusively being a punching bag or being exclusively based around weather, it's really not that bad of a gimmick to drop. And then yeah, as far as moveset goes, it's in line for a lot of bite style attacks. I think that's a pretty solid A tier. And then the base form, just use the evolution, and this is the first time that's meant Mega Evolution. And then its neighbor on the tier list here, Sableye. I think you do the same thing. Have Mega Sableye fight with a gem as kind of a pseudo two-handed club. The Mega Evolution is defensive and its ability is Magic Bounce, which bounces hazards back, so you know it's going to have some really good reflector moves in there. Power Gem would make an excellent neutral special projectile. Then throw in some nasty little Gremlin style moves on top of that. I really like that too. I'm not sure that this small Pokemon that just hunkers up would necessarily be the most fun thing to go up against, but there's clearly a strong direction. And same deal as Mile for the base form. Yeah, you could definitely make a moveset around this too and have the Mega Evolution come out more selectively, but there's so much more potential with the Mega. Finneon, Luminion, Floppy Fish, Plusle, and Minun. Look, I'm not saying they'd be great and they're very, very blatantly competing with Pikachu and Pichu, but the fact that they operate as a positively and negatively charged duo, there's something to that. An Ice Climbers-ish kind of design. Duos are complicated, and I'm not willing to expend too much brain power on this one, but there's something there. I don't think these are F tier. Panda Mouse and Mousehold, though, okay, that's pushing things a bit. I know there's supposed to be some of Scarlet and Violet's goofier Pokemon, but the joke doesn't really land for me. They're just bland. Mousehold is bringing something to the table, though. It's like 2 sets of linked Pokemon that hasn't really been done before. I just wish the mice themselves had some kind of variation between them, although I think they're supposed to be based on lab mice, so that's kind of the point. Alright, C tier. Beautifly and Dustox, Gen 3, and we're already starting to rehash Pokemon. Yeah, Flappy Wings, and I'm not giving the Cocoons any consideration whatsoever. They're just bad. Wurmple, whatever, I just feel nothing. Oh yeah, they did it again. Stop making butterflies. Oricorio. This is a design that I thought actually worked really well in Pokemon Sun and Moon. Kind of a Darwin's Finches thing. They change form depending on which island you're on. And it is better than a lot of bird Pokemon in the sense that at the very least it's standing upright. It's a dancer Pokemon and its dances are generally done on the ground instead of in the air. They're still small and pretty awkwardly shaped. You could get some decent attack animations out of each one, but combining them is tricky. Fitting them into the Smash template is tricky. You could have a Pokemon trainer that makes use of them, I guess. Kahili is an Elite Four member in Sun and Moon who uses Oricorio, but of all the characters and of all the Pokemon to expend that gimmick on, really, I'm gonna go C tier for these to acknowledge the fact that at least I had to stop and think for a second about them, but realistically, I'm being pretty generous. Gen 7 I like much better. Buzzwole, the first Ultra Beast we're looking at. Look at that, textbook heavyweight plus 4 legs plus a mosquito beak to peck at you with, all great. I feel like as a mosquito, canonically, it should have a bit more of a life leech focus. The Ultra Beasts all have Beast Boost as their ability, which means that when they knock out an opponent, they get stronger, which does translate into Smash actually pretty comfortable. Yeah, you knock an opponent out, and you get a stat boost until you get knocked out yourself. It's not super exciting and maybe a bit lopsided and steamrollery, but I don't think it's the most steamrollery thing that would appear in Ultimate. And because Buzzwole is one of the biggest and strongest of the Ultra Beasts, it's a pretty good fit for it. I think heavyweights having that kind of ability that favors them surviving is cool, and it definitely seems to be one of the fan favorite Ultra Beasts. Yeah, this is gonna go S tier. This is sort of the representative of the group, I think. Nihilego is kind of interesting. It's got a neurotoxin that controls people, so you could have some kind of mechanic where it like latches onto an opponent and you can control them briefly. I think that sounds cooler than it would actually end up being, though. Certainly in one-on-one fights, which to be fair is not the only thing you designed for. I know in the show it had a somewhat prominent role where it had sort of an illusion and memory theme to it. That's a bit hard to translate into Smash. Its body type almost works, and it has movements that are supposed to sometimes resemble that of a girl, which would definitely be creepy, but it's still ultimately a bit spindly and not nearly enough of it's there. It's not the worst concept out there, I guess. B tier. Pheromosa has the same spindly problem, except much worse. It's kind of a write-off from that alone. Has very little going on outside of that too. It's based on a beauty queen, so you might expect it to have sort of an allure moveset, moves like Attract and Charm, but it doesn't even do that. Yeah, that's an F tier. May as well just keep the Ultra Beast train rolling here. Xurkitree. It's an electric type Pokemon with a pretty basic moveset overall and not really much significance to Pokemon either, but it does have a body shape that works decently well, and because it's based on wiring, it could have some really fun bendy animations. I'll go B tier. Celesteela. Striking design, if nothing else. Kind of a bamboo meets rocket ship thing. The fact that its arms are totally stiff means there's not that much for it to do, and its torso is extremely skinny, although that is balanced out by the hair or shell, so I don't think any hurtbox issues would really pop up. The big stiff floating arms are kind of cool, but also pretty restrictive in a lot of ways. Nothing that inspiring in the moveset. In the show, again, the main thing it does is that sort of rocket blast off thing. That's the part that really stands out. I'll give it a C. It's kind of whatever. Kartana, an origami sword fighter, grass steel. It's cool. I like it conceptually. Like a lot of the Ultra Beasts, though, it is very foreign and alien and featureless, which is intentional, admittedly. But considering I know there are going to be more sword fighter type Pokemon to look at, why would I go with this one? C tier again. It's functional, but it's not interesting. If it could like unfold and refold itself into a bunch of different shapes, we may be looking at something different there, but as far as I can tell, there's no source saying it can do that. Naganado. At first glance, this design just doesn't really look like it should work at all. It doesn't have legs, but I could see it keeping itself upright with its wings, and its stinger is sort of slanted forward a bit on the ground. That's not a horrible stance. I really like it and used it on my team, like I'm sure a lot of people did. It's a poison dragon that's shoved in your face. That's gonna happen. Like I said, I'm a sucker for poison Pokemon, and there's a lot to work with here. It's a dragon type, so it's also got a lot of interesting features that you could pull from in that aspect. Could make plenty of good moves based around and stinger thrusts. It's blatantly supposed to be the cool Ultra Beast, but yeah, they got me, A tier. Poipolag, give me the dragon. Stakataka. Having a bunch of different organisms form themselves into a tower like that is interesting, but like with the unknown, just because it's an interesting swarm design doesn't mean it's a good Smash design. It's a box with legs. Blacephalon. This is the fireworks Pokemon, and it's the other kind of performance-based one alongside Xurkitree. I think this one is way more entertaining though. Even though its face is literally a circle, it's got a lot of personality to it, and you could have some really fun animation work. Insane movement and fireworks displays that could look really cool, and that obviously implies a gameplay direction to it, lots of explosive attacks. Its signature move is Mind Blown, which is a very powerful explosion that also does self-damage to it, but not in an instant self-knockout style, something like Explosion or Self-Destruct would do. So yeah, a self-damage style kind of like Pichu, except on a smaller selection of moves and taken to a much higher degree. A bit redundant maybe, but it still sounds like a lot of fun. A tier. And then we have Guzzlord, who doesn't really work. It's kind of got a heavyweight grappler thing going on there. The mouth in the middle of the body is actually kind of interesting from a design perspective. Its body shape is probably a bit too clunky for Smash, but it's not unusable, and my complaints would mainly be with the way it had to move around, and obviously it wouldn't really be moving around that well anyways. Okay, it's a bit rough to work with, but I think you could work with it. Let's go B. Alright, let's just do a bit of cleanup on Gen 7 here. Necrozma is another Pokemon where its base form doesn't really matter, it exists for the sake of transforming into something else. I'm thrown for a loop right off the bat though, because I kind of hate these designs. We have Dawn Wings Necrozma, and I think unlike base form Lunala, this one can stand. It still definitely doesn't look like it's supposed to though. Duskmane Necrozma, as with Solgaleo versus Lunala, works better. I think it's way too busy still, and it doesn't even really look that much like a Pokemon, but it's functional at least. We're gonna start with Ultra Necrozma though, because this is easy. You know what? Just take them out of Pokemon as well. This is potentially my single least favorite Pokemon design ever, and as far as I'm concerned, is the series totally jumping the shark. It looks like the kind of fan Yu-Gi-Oh card I would have drawn when I was 12. Necrozma is going in just to use the evolution tier, and that evolution in question is Duskmane Necrozma, which is okay. And I'll move Dawn Wings Necrozma up there as well, because I think there is a world where you could sort of use both of them together, a bit like what I was talking about with the Jin, right? You spend way more of your time in the sort of lion quadruped form, but if you need to break out a recovery move or certain burst movement options, maybe your jumps, then you get the bat. And if you absolutely need to bring Ultra Necrozma out for the final smash, you do you. It's not going any higher on my list. Relicanth is a floppy fish, so is Huntail, and I know this is more of an eel, but it's no Milotic, right? You put it up on land and it's gonna flop around plenty. Gorobus 2, Love Disc, Barboach, Whiscash. Yeah, you know, maybe 7.8 too much water was onto something. Carvana, Sharpedo, that's a bit of a shame. I like this one. Whalmer and Wailord. Okay, let's be real. They're also floppy fish, but it feels like doing them a bit of a disservice. They are whale tier, which is technically worse than floppy fish because they're fish and they're too big, but they definitely stick in your head more. Sadly, that's where Kyogre kind of has to go too, and I have so much nostalgic attachment to Kyogre, my first box legendary ever. Both me and my brother asked for Sapphire, which was probably not the smartest move, but we really liked Kyogre. What about the others though? Do I want to pair them up? I think Rayquaza just straight up does not work, leave him alone. And Groudon actually does kind of function. You would need to scale him down, but he's got a good body shape and he's based on ground. But his playstyle is also heavily centered around introducing extreme weather. You could bring Groudon in as the base form and have Kyogre and Rayquaza show up in the final smash, but just leave them be. I'm going to scatter them around the tiers a little bit. I know with Groudon, it's specifically Primal Groudon, who's more associated with the weather thing, but it's still definitely the version of Groudon that's best known. Hardly matters anyway, because the intention is the exact same with all three of them. Just let them do their thing in Pokemon. Malamar. This is a fun one, the Overturning Pokemon. It's an upside down squid, and being upside down is a major part of its identity. It's got a long history of you needing to actually physically flip your device upside down before it'll evolve in whatever game it's in. But once it is evolved, I think there's a lot to work with here. It's got really big whippy arms that it can slap you around with and grab you with. It knows Topsy-Turvy and it has Contrary as an ability, and you could have a cool mechanic where after some or all of its moves, if you hold a button down, it enters an upside down stance, where its moves that changes completely until it does another attack. A lot of work for the developers, but we're in pure fantasy territory here. Who cares? I'm only really taking that into account for Echo Fighters. A tier Borderline S. It's really fun. Inkay is just kind of a baby squid though. Cute, but that's about it. Another Pokemon with the Contrary ability where all of your stat changes are inverted. Superior, but I'm gonna bring PK Beats back to talk about that.
Superior's got good speed with the potential to have huge range and flexibility due to its snake physique, but its attacking stats generally leave a bit to be desired. That is until you consider its hidden ability Contrary, which can be paired with Leaf Storm, a powerful move that would normally decrease your special attack, but with this hidden ability, your special attack would actually go up. Now, being able to essentially give yourself rage by just using a move would be even more DLC than what DLC is, so maybe we can do an inverse of rage. After all, if more rage makes you stronger, having contrary would mean having more rage would make you weaker, which could perhaps incentivize a more hit-and-run playstyle. And it could be paired still with some form of Leaf Storm, where you can get some of your power back by landing the attack, which will be in limited supply, perhaps like Banjo-Kazooie's Wonder Wing. If this was paired with the new Pokemon Trainer loadout, then you could either start out with Superior to try and get some Leaf Storms in order to increase your power and offset any that you might lose by getting Rage, or to make use of Contrary in the context of whoever it is you're fighting against. Or you could save Superior for when you're at higher percents and focus on Footsies, or whatever the snake equivalent of that is, using their high speeds to avoid getting KO'd, at the cost of being a lot less powerful. I'm thinking like Lucario with no aura, and this footsie meta can be balanced out by giving Superior a larger hurt box, because having a runaway forever strategy, as we know, sucks. Now, because Smash generally doesn't have many debuffs in play, the contrary ability would be inherently less interesting in this context, which is why I won't place them in S tier, but I still think a snake physique is a pretty cool fit for the game, so I'll still put them in the A tier. And there's a lot of unique ways to tackle the contrary ability to make them fun and interesting. Also, a quick side note, but the reason why I chose Superior as my favorite Pokemon is mostly because it was my first ever shiny. So in that vein, it and every Pokemon in this video has to have a shiny alternate costume. Like, not bootleg, kinda shiny alts, like just give us the shinies, man. Okay, that's it. Thank you for having me, Muckrock.
Lurantis is another Pokemon with Contrary. Other than that, it's just kind of a Mantis. Okay, in all honesty, it's actually not a bad choice, and it learns some interesting moves like Petal Blizzard, for example, which is one that not many Pokemon get, but I'm gonna give it a B tier, and Fomantis just used the evolution, because if we're talking about Mantis Pokemon, you know we're going straight to the Scyther line. Scizor is the obvious go-to here. He's an all-time fan favorite Pokemon, and his moveset has so much obvious potential. He would use gripping style moves with those giant mechanical pincers, and then he's one of the most notorious users of Bullet Punch, so of course that's working its way in. An extremely fast but not particularly strong burst movement option, it makes itself. Give it Lunge or U-turn for an up special. Maybe you can have some kind of sword stance where it goes on the offensive. I think Scyther could be a reasonably effective Echo Fighter for Scizor. Obviously it's got different shaped arms, so for some moves that use the claws you would need to adjust the animation, but that's pretty much all you'd need to do. Maybe change around one or two steel type moves that seem inappropriate. And then you have Cleavor, who you can say more or less the same thing about. He would be a harder hitting, slower variant. Its signature move Stone Axe could make for a really good forward smash animation. Now in Pokemon Legends Arceus, it has a high critical hit rate. I don't think we need to try and translate the critical hit mechanic. They tried it with Dragon Quest. I don't think it works. But the other thing it does is stick splinters into an opponent so they take damage over the course of a few turns. I think that could work. You could just have it do a damage over time thing, but I think save that for the poison types. Maybe make it so it messes with their mobility a bit. Maybe make it so that the next hit that Cleavor lands does extra damage. You're like driving the stone shards into them. Then throw like one more rock type move in there and make the same kind of animation changes you would need to for Scyther, and this one doesn't fly like Scizor does, so a bit more adjustment would be needed. This would be definitely one of the higher effort Echo Fighters, but I think still well within the realm of possibility. Scizor is still going to be the poster child, and that's an S tier for me. And the others, yeah, good Echo Fighters. Heliolisk. There are a couple of vaguely interesting things going on with this design. It has Parabolic Charge, which is a healing electric move. That's not common. It's also got Electrify, which turns other moves into electric types. But at the end of the day, it's a small, speedy electric Pokemon. We have that. This is a C tier. I don't think it's bringing that much to the table. And Helioptile is it without the collar, the most interesting aspect. Skuntank. It's a pretty straightforward quadruped. Apart from that giant bushy tail, you could definitely get some attacks out of that. And it's a skunk, so it's got some charm to it, and it's obviously a poison type, so it would use a lot of poison and cloud style moves. Yeah, B tier. It's not brilliant, but there is a clear direction to it. And Stunky is actually a pretty good Echo Fighter too. Poison Pokemon I like even more though, Toxicroak. Tons of personality on this one, really cool design, would fit very well into Smash. Bipedal with a horn and spikes on its hands to attack with, that's essentially textbook. It's got that sack, which I'm pretty sure is supposed to be more like a sack that a frog vocalizes with, but you could definitely put some kind of charge attack in there where the sack swells up. It's poison fighting type with a poison touch ability, which means it can sometimes poison on contact, so yeah, you give it beat 'em up moves with poison effects. A bit like Grafaiai, but this one's nowhere near as speed oriented. And I'm putting it in S tier. I love it personally, and I think that it just slots right into Smash. I think adapting Sludge Bomb could make for a pretty cool up special that like surges up inside the ball of sludge. As for Croagunk, strictly speaking, it's not a perfect match for Toxicroak, but it's a pretty solid pick and a fun Pokemon in its own right. Arguably even more popular in Pokken, they definitely showed it favoritism. Croagunk, yeah, put it in too. I'd be on board with that. I guess I never really cleaned up the Superior line. Let's do that. Snivy, I know it's got its fans in its own right. It showed up in a fan game and stuff like that. You can't really make it an Echo Fighter though, and I don't think its presence is really strong enough to work on its own merits. Yeah, sorry Snivy fans, that's an F. Same with Servine. Now, you could make these two Echo Fighters of each other if you wanted, but I'm not going there. Let's finish up this line while we're at it. Embor. Oh look, it's a firefighting type starter. Great. If we're looking at the heavy fire starters, you've got Incineroar and you've got Charizard you're competing against. If we're going firefighting type starters, there are multiple other candidates I'd much rather have. I think the heavyweight angle is definitely what you're looking at, especially because its signature move is Heat Crash, and that one's not really that interesting. All it does is scale up the damage based on the weight differential between the two characters, which is not a mechanic I'd want to see replicated in Smash. And on a personal note, I think Embor is just one of the overall ugliest final starter evolutions we've gotten, and the same applies to Pignite, the middle evolution, although I'll give that one at least a bit of a nod for the name. And the same applies to Tepig, including the name. Now, I like what they've done, you know, Tepig, Pignite, Embor, it's clever, but from a pragmatic and personal sense, not interested. F tier. Which leaves us with Oshawott and Duat, and these just don't work as Echo Fighters at all because it's the very rare case where they start out bipedal and then the final evolution is a quadruped, and they're just not super interesting to me, so those are definitely just use the evolution. And you know what? I'm putting base form Samurott there too because it's fine, but the Hisuian variant, this is clearly where the love went. It's water dark instead of pure water, so it has definitely more of an identity going on, and it doesn't look that different visually, but I would say that basically everything they have changed is an improvement. Its signature move is Ceaseless Edge, which works just like Stone Axe. One thing I didn't mention though is that the amount of splinters changes depending on whether you use strong or agile style, so I'm bringing in a bit of a curveball here. Is going up in S tier with Hisuian Typhlosion and Hisuian Decidueye, because if you want to make a Pokemon trainer from the Hisui region who fights using that strong and agile style that I talked about adapting earlier, I am so into that. Yeah, I know they're all fully evolved, that's totally fine because in Pokemon Legends Arceus, it just uses the standard form of the Pokemon until they fully evolve. There's nothing saying you need different evolution stages, and because Pokemon Legends Arceus is a much more active game where you as the trainer actually are put in harm's way, this is the perfect opportunity to actually bring the Pokemon trainer onto the battlefield like I was talking about earlier and have each Pokemon responsible for different attacks. Hisuian Typhlosion's signature move is Infernal Parade, a blast of fireballs that does more damage if the target has a status condition. Yeah, bring it in and put some other moves on the kit that inflict status conditions. Maybe one of those status conditions can be the defense drop inflicted by Hisuian Decidueye's triple arrow. You don't really need to be too literal with them. Plus, you know that one's going to be doing a lot of kicks with those massive talons. I can see it so clearly between the Pokemon trainer's active participation and all these great source moves to pull from and the strong agile style, this would just be a slam dunk. Sadly, this is never happening because Pokemon Legends Arceus never got the recognition it deserved, but this does not need to be a realistic list. So I guess we have a couple more starter lines to talk about. I think Hisuian Typhlosion's spiritual ghost fire thing is much more interesting than base level Typhlosion's pure fire. There's plenty of other stuff in Smash like that. Admittedly, there was less at the time when Gold and Silver first came out, but even then it wasn't totally new territory. The flames erupting from its back are a bit of a direction you could go in, but summoning fire, are we really looking at a shortage of that among Pokemon? Upstaged, Cyndaquil and Quilava are pretty good Echo Fighters, though more so of the base level Typhlosion obviously, but if you wanted to go a different direction and have Hisuian Typhlosion be like its own Pokemon, just as a standalone thing, then having a fire ghost versus pure fire dynamic between Echo Fighters could be cool. Meganium grass quadruped that just kind of does grass stuff. Its theme is I'm a flower, and it's got plenty of competition there. I do like the idea of having a Pokemon that's just like, I'm a grass type. I put grass moves front and center. That's what I do. But I think there are better candidates. It's kind of a bland design. Doesn't do anything I think other Pokemon couldn't do better. The neck swinging thing is kind of cool, but even then, it's got competition, even just restricted to grass types. For me, this is an F tier, and you know I'm not shy about putting my own spin on this list, but I'll put it in B because, you know, it is a starter. I'm sure plenty of people have nostalgic attachment to it, and the body type isn't horrible, the moveset's not horrible, you could make it work. Bayleaf would actually be quite a good Echo Fighter. Chikorita not so much, it's missing the frill and its neck is too short. For Alligator, now Gen 2's getting good. Big, slow, heavyweight water crocodile that chomps on you a lot. I'm almost describing Reptar from Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 here, who has shown that you can design this body type to actually work quite well in a platform fighter. Obviously not totally one-to-one translatable, but would function pretty similarly. You could have the tail attacks and the jaw jaw attacks, plus an elemental twist with the water typing. Admittedly not an incredibly in-demand type, but it is a cool pairing with this archetype. Plus you can give it fake tears as a taunt. That'd be great. A tier. And Totodile would actually make quite a good Echo Fighter. Technically so would Croconaw if only the two of them existed, but who are we kidding? You're picking Totodile. I realized that Typhlosion and Samurott should definitely be in the same tier. And then we have the rest of the Gen 7 starters. Litten and Torracat are jumping right back in to just use the evolution. They're quadrupeds, Incineroar's not, what can I say? Rowlet and Dartrix I've got to do the same because for either form of Decidueye, there's a very, very clear theme that their body type is facilitating, and in both cases, these guys just don't cut it. Speaking of Decidueye, this is probably the only one of the three Hisuian starters where I'd say I prefer the original variant, but Vernius is coming back on and it's the Pokemon he has to talk about, which considering he's a pit player, yeah, that checks out.
When Monkrok asked me for a Pokemon I wanted added to Smash, I immediately thought of Decidueye. He's by far one of my favorite grass-type Pokemon, and be able to bow and arrow just like Pit does, so they'd be an instant new main for me. Decidueye having a really unique pool of moves to use is also another great selling point in my opinion. I could totally imagine them using a mixture of grass, flying, and even some ghost-type moves in his Smash moveset. In terms of playstyle, I want them to play super fast with great airspeed and mobility, paired with a bunch of range attacks as well. But to compensate for that, they'd have light weight to make them not completely unstoppable while flying around at Mach speeds. Oh, and speaking of flying, they'd absolutely have at least 3 jumps. Decidueye and Pit would definitely be best friends if they ever got into Smash.
The Hitmons, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, Hitmontop. Hitmonchan is a boxer Pokemon, which raises some obvious concerns since Little Mac is in the game. The gimmick here would be elemental punches, which is something, but his whole thing is a boxer, and we already have someone whose whole thing is being a boxer, F tier. Now, admittedly, there is room for a boxer who's better designed than Little Mac, but it's still too close. Hitmonlee is a kicker. It does a lot of kicks. That's something a bit different, I guess, although we already have multiple brawler style characters whose movesets are completely dominated by kicks. I'll do C tier for this one. I kind of want to go F as well, but at the very least it's better than Hitmonchan. Actually, I have that power. D tier. Let's bring the mice down there as well. Hitmontop. Okay, this one's a bit better, right? It is still a very basic fighter at the end of the day, but it's got a gimmick. It's got a point on its head that it goes on and it spins around and kicks using that. It's a direction. How many times can you really force that into its moveset though? And other than that, what does it do? It does a lot of kicks and a lot of punches. And I guess you could have it use the spike on its head offensively, and is kind of implied to have a capoeira-based playstyle. The Japanese name is Capora or something along those lines. So definitely the best of the three. I don't think I'm willing to go higher than C tier though. Like I said, fighting types are kind of inherently disadvantaged. They're competing against each other. There are just so many that would slot into Smash. It's still just a monotype. It still doesn't really do anything that interesting, doesn't really bring any unique mechanics to the table that you wouldn't have to basically pull out of thin air. And as far as Tyrogue goes, if I'm not interested in the evolutions, why do I want the more boring junior form? Lantern, I like it, but it's a floppy fish. So is Chinchu. Noctowl, I like it, but it's flappy wings, so is Hoot Hoot. Also, why is this normal flying? Why isn't it dark? Like, they had the dark type in Gen 2. It was actually what introduced it. You'd think if anything, they'd want to show it off more. You know a dark Pokemon that I really like though? Darkrai, this dark phantom based around sleep and bad dream infliction. With a pretty good body type for Smash too. It does float, but it's got those quote-unquote coattails that you could drag along the ground and just treat as a hurt box. It's fine. Sleep is admittedly a bit of a tough thing to translate into a fighting game. You have to basically just treat it as like a stun effect, and Darkrai's signature ability is Bad Dreams, which poisons Pokemon essentially while they're asleep. And that doesn't work super well because you can't have them just passed out for extended amounts of time in Smash. It's more just like enough time to get a setup and then you move on with the game. It's kind of a shame because you can see how it would go. Its signature move Dark Void would put opponents to sleep, and then it could use something like Ominous Wind as an up special, and his body type is really good and it could have some incredible animation work on it, but I don't think I can go above a B tier, which is painful. I really like Darkrai, but you're just giving up a bit too much of its core identity for my liking. Plus, if you're going down the ethereal sleep-based Pokemon route, you're up against some pretty stiff competition. Mr. Danish Buttercookie, what you got for us?
I think a super cool Pokemon to add to the Smash roster would be Gengar. Not only is he one of the most beloved Pokemon in the series, there's actually a lot of potential here, and compared to the other Pokemon, he can be pretty unique. Picture this, a large Donkey Kong sized character that moves as fast as Ridley. It's pretty cool. As for his moveset, I was thinking his down B could have Hypnosis, like a small area of effect sleep move, kind of like Jigglypuff's Sing. But even cooler would be that if he used it again on a sleeping enemy, Gengar would use Dream Eater and siphon the opponent's health. He could have Shadow Ball like Mewtwo, but I was thinking Dark Pulse would be some cool combo ender instead. This could be his neutral special. Like you'd combo someone and at the end of it, you just use Dark Pulse and it would just eliminate them. His up B would be Levitate or something simple. And then his side B could be something goofy like Lick or something. I think it would hit pretty hard. Maybe a command grab with Lick. I think his side B would be pretty goofy. And then I was thinking that after a certain amount of time, he would Mega Evolve. Maybe then his Dark Pulse could be a Shadow Ball instead or something. And all of his other moves would just be enhanced and deal more damage and knockback. He'd be on his fists like DK. It would be pretty sick. Some sort of time-based thing. It could be a damage-based thing. But either way, I would like that to be kind of his limit. And then his final smash would be the Gigantamax version of himself. And he would just swallow everyone up and torment everyone inside of him. Like a truly terrifying badass. I think he'd be absolutely perfect. Thanks, Mockrock, for having me, by the way. Good luck with the rest of the vid, and have a good one.
Now, personally, as much as I do like Gengar, I've always been in the Haunter is cooler camp, but I've got to admit Gengar is definitely the right choice. Not only is it obviously just way more popular overall, it's one of the most popular Pokemon, but Haunter also just isn't the best body shape for Smash. It floats around at quite a sharp slant, which also means it doesn't really work as an Echo Fighter. Ghastly gets the same treatment. Jellicent is a fun ghost design. You could call them floppy fish, but you know, because they're ghosts, they can float around, and their body shape is still not necessarily fantastic in that circumstance. They just have a very big head and small torso. It's kind of a weird ratio for a fighting game. Maybe serviceable. As fun as their designs are though, that's kind of when their luck starts running thin. Their special defense tanks, that's a bit of a rough identity to try and translate. Their movesets don't really add any kind of depth beyond that. I like them, but they're pretty typical C tiers. They're the kind of Pokemon where you could make them work if you really desperately wanted to force it, but there's just so many better options. If you do want to force them in, Fillich is actually a reasonably functional Echo Fighter. You change the head dimensions and you radically change the identity, so you know, relatively simple change that has big effects on gameplay, but it's not interesting. While we're talking about things that aren't interesting, Throw and Sock. It's Gen 5 remaking Pokemon again, the Hitmon Muppets. Oh no, they would totally work. Throw uses a lot of grapple style moves and then Sock hits you a lot. What, you want a medal for that? I refuse on principle to even entertain these things. Lowest tier I can give. Seismitoad, this is almost another Gen 5 rehash. At least it's a bit different though. It's a bigger, bulkier Pokemon and it's water ground instead of water poison, which means it's just kind of taking half a step off Toxicroak's toes and putting it right back down on Swampbird's. It's okay. C tier, I'd much rather take one of those. Palpitoad doesn't really work as an Echo Fighter. Okay, let's balance things out with a good Gen 5 Pokemon and even a good fighting type Pokemon, Mienshao. A speedy mid-range kung fu fighter who uses its fur like whips. That's actually kind of cool as a mid-range concept. Obviously, we already have tons of martial arts inspiration in Smash, including some that are very directly taken from real martial arts, but a dedicated Chinese style like Wing Chun or something like that, there's actually not really anything like that in Smash right now, and then you make it a sword fighter style, but not even really a sword fighter style, or even ignore the sword fighter parallels and just go to straight up whip strikes. That's pretty cool. Yeah, A tier. And then Mienfoo as an Echo Fighter would be the same thing without the whip strikes, so it would just be like swinging its arms and it's got stubby little hitboxes. You could make that work, but I don't think it's that interesting. Would probably take quite a few changes too. Tyrantrum and Aurorus. Even as someone who hasn't played Gen 6, this is a strong set of fossil Pokemon, goddamn. For a Tyrantrum, who is just a straight up T-Rex, but also gets to be a dragon type and a rock type, so that's pretty cool. It can have a couple of different abilities. Strong Jaw increases the power of bite moves by 50%, and Rock Head removes recoil damage. So just make that the basis of the playstyle, coming back again to that Reptar inspiration I was talking about earlier, in some ways even more blatant. Aurorus' ability comes into play here too, Refrigerate, which makes normal type moves ice type, so I think it would be fun if he made multiples of its normals able to freeze. That's not a realistic option, that's what the competitive community calls moves like jabs, tilts, smash attacks, and dash attack, but I doubt that's the same in Japan where the games are actually made, but we're just spitballing here. I still think Aurorus is a cool quadruped design who could definitely get a lot of work out of its long neck and its like mystical ice and rocky ice type moves. Tyrantrum strong A tier, Aurorus upper B, and then both their pre-evolutions, Tyrunt and Amora, would make great Echo Fighters. Corviknight. flappy wings, very heavy flappy wings, but you still want this thing flying. It's the flying taxi service in Gen 8, come on. Obviously the same deal with Rookidee and Corvisquire, and then Skarmory, the Pokemon that Corviknight was blatantly designed to be the power crept version of, and one of my favorite Pokemon ever, by the way. Yeah, leave it in Pokemon. Much stronger Gen 8 candidate, Grimmsnarl. Really cool, just base level Pokemon design to start things off. Dark Fairy looking like this folklore nightmare coming right out of the Black Forest. It's got a bit of almost a Bayonetta thing going on where its hair works like muscle fibers and it can unfurl them and use them to snag people. Obviously has some really strong gameplay implications. Its signature move is False Surrender, which in the Pokemon series ignores accuracy and evasiveness, so I think you could treat it the same as I proposed for Houndoom's Odor Sleuth, where if an opponent is dodging, it hits them anyways and actually gets better. That'd be very in line with its tricky fairy tale nature. If you just take a look at the list of moves it can learn: Confide, Fake Out, False Surrender, Flatter, Fake Tears, Assurance, Sucker Punch. I'd want to see a bunch of dodge style moves where it like rears back and then charges back in. That's an S tier for me. And then Impidimp and Morgrim. The hair manipulation is a big part of the interest of Grimmsnarl to me, and Morgrim does have it, but in a way that you would need to completely redesign how it worked. Just use Grimmsnarl. The Toucannon line are all flappy wings. I like Toucannon as far as regional birds go, and it would work better than some. I'm not asking for quite the same kind of majestic flights as some of the regional birds would get, and its beak definitely gives it more gameplay direction, but I don't think it's enough to bump it up a tier. Primarina. So this one's signature move is Sparkling Aria, which cures burns. That's not interesting. And most of the rest of its moveset honestly isn't that inspired, but it does have great animation work. And it would be kind of cool to get a seal in there somewhere. I suspect most of them aren't going to make it very far. This sort of seems like the one that could, like a very mobile seal. It's got really big long fins and a flappy tail that it could fight with. I still think it's by far the worst Gen 7 candidate, whereas Decidueye could drop right into Smash and Incineroar is Incineroar, but it's solid. This feels too low, honestly. I think it's in the wrong tier. I think part of it's also I've been just a bit too generous with some of these. I'll leave Guzzlord as the B tier Ultra Beast, the others are coming down to C, and then Executor and Arbok, Gogoat, Jellicent, and Seismitoad, those are getting D tier. They're just barely hanging in there. As far as Popplio and Brionne go, they're actually pretty decent Echo Fighter candidates if you're gonna take that route. Yeah, I brought it up. Here are the rest of the seals. Yeah, here's Seal. It's a seal, so I guess that's a pretty good acid test. Okay, maybe let's go to Dugong first, and it's not necessarily floppy fish territory, but I just can't see this thing really moving around on stage. Plus, it's basically just a seal. You could technically maybe make it surf on water, kind of like Squirtle does. You could even make that argument for some of the fish, but all that effort for a seal? I mean, I'm supposed to be saying for a Dugong, but no, it looks like a seal. But not nearly as much as Seal, who is going in F tier right alongside it. And if that wasn't enough, we have Spheal, the spherical seal. I don't know who thought we needed this, but you know what? I want to shake their hand. This is kind of fun. I don't know who decided to drop the theme afterwards, but I'm not shaking their hand. Sealeo is a seal. Again. It evolves into Walrein though, and Walrein is a Pokemon that I actually like. I use it on my Pokemon Legends Arceus team. It could be kind of a fun heavyweight, throw its body around a lot, use a lot of ice and water beam attacks, attack with its tusks, but it's fundamentally got the same problem where I just have a really hard time picturing this thing actually moving around on stage. You would need to force it to a degree that there are just so many Pokemon that wouldn't apply to. Spheal is getting comedy tier. I'll put it right up there alongside the other spheres. Execute's close enough, why not? I don't know what Sealeo is doing here. Get him out of Pokemon too. Walrein should be a D tier or an F tier, but I'm gonna give it the bias bump up to C. Barraskewda is actually a pretty cool fish Pokemon design, but you know the drill, floppy fish. Arrokuda, it's pre-evolution though. That one's going in comedy tier because it's what Cramorant spends his time spitting out. Slacking is a Pokemon who's completely dominated by two things: ridiculously powerful stats and the Truant ability, which means it has to spend every other turn loafing around. You could kind of interpret that as a heavyweight design where it has really bad recovery on its moves or really bad startup. That's not quite extreme enough for me, and I don't think there's a way to really precisely translate this into Smash, so I would rather just let it be. Slackoth, its pre-evolution, looks kind of funny, I guess, but it's no Spheal, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, no one's asking for any of these, including Vigoroth, the middle evolution that just randomly becomes hyper aggro, although props for making a middle evolution that really does stand out. Speaking of the hyper aggro route, we've got Mankey, Primeape, and Annihilape. Mankey and Primeape are pretty bare bones, but Annihilape has some stuff going on. I know it's been really controversially powerful in the competitive scene. This is one where you could almost do Primeape turning into Annihilape as kind of a Super Saiyan limit break kind of deal. That is basically what's going on. believe lore-wise it evolves into Annihilape after its rage just gets too much for its physical body, which is why Annihilape is fighting Ghost type, which is a really cool typing. I still say you just go with Annihilape though, and despite the kind of cool flavor and legitimately interesting typing, direction-wise, it's not nearly as interesting as I might expect. Its signature move is Rage Fist, which powers up for every time it's gotten hit during the battle, and it's pretty easy to translate that into Smash, but Rage is already a whole mechanic, and then you have a character like Kazuya where Rage Drive is literally something he already has. Terry has a similar comeback mechanic, and Lucario's in that camp as well, and that's just a fighting Pokemon that it's competing with. At first glance, I was like, oh yeah, Annihilape's great, but then if I think about it more, the reason my mind went there is because I've seen all of this in Smash already. I think I gotta go C tier at best. Put Primeape up there with it to acknowledge the potential dual playstyle you could make. And then Mankey just is the evolution. Not only does it not really fit into that dynamic, but it's also got a tail that you need to account for in all the animations. At least I have an opinion on them though. Minccino? Cinccino? Never have I felt less emotion when I was looking at a Pokemon. A nice cooldown after all this rage talk. Let's chill out a bit more with Meloetta. I like this design. I'm not generally into Pokemon that look quite this human. It can come off as a bit creepy, and I'm not saying they totally avoid that, but the music staff for hair thing is such a cool concept. There are two versions of Meloetta. There's Aria form and Pirouette form, and it's pretty easy to picture a bit of a chic Zelda thing going on where Aria form is a bit slower and longer ranged, and Pirouette form is more agile, and you trigger this change by connecting a move called Relic Song, which you could just assign to a down special, maybe make it a damaging move if you want to differentiate it a bit more from Pokemon Switch or Sheik and Zelda's old Transform. But I think you could do a bit more with it and make it more intentional and more dynamic. Give Meloetta special canceling on some moves like the Shotos can do, except they can only cancel into Relic Song. Make it like a radiating, damage-dealing move that causes them to transform when it's used, and let them start a combo, activate Relic Song, and then make the transformation so fast that maybe even in some cases they can continue their combo after the transformation. I think that concept is super cool, and there are a lot of form-changing Pokemon, but this one has some of the most potential as far as I'm concerned. That's an S tier. Let's stay on that music theme for a bit. Please welcome Aranitmar to the channel, who's going to talk about Toxtricity.
When people started talking about the very real possibility that a Pokemon could be one of Smash Ultimate's DLC fighters, I always sort of prepared for a very basic pick, a starter or a legendary, or God forbid, another fire Pokemon. But there was one pick that actually stood out to me, and to this day, if we have to get another Pokemon, this is one of my picks, and that is Toxtricity. We've never really had a music or sound-based fighter in Smash. We've had assist trophies, or like DK's old Final Smash, but we haven't really had one where the whole point was the music and the sound that this fighter could produce. So having a full fighter's moveset built around this idea of music would be really sick. You could have sound-based attacks, or like a basic projectile where it's a sonic boom of sound waves, and that's not even to mention the fact that Toxtricity is also a poison and electric type Pokemon. So we've got sound, poison, and electric moves that could all be fused into this really unique moveset that we haven't really seen anything like in Smash before. And of course, you know I'm all about the different costumes that characters can have in Smash, so Toxtricity having the two different forms of Amped and Low Key is just perfect for this hypothetical fighter.
Yeah, Toxtricity, specifically the base version, is my favorite Gen 8 Pokemon, and one of my favorite Pokemon ever, and definitely one of my picks for an actual Smash candidate that I think would really slot in well. That doesn't make Toxel follow up behind it, though. Mantine and Mantike. Oh, this is interesting. Are they flappy wings or floppy fish? They're floppy wings. Gotta do what you gotta do. Lunatone and Solrock. They are inanimate objects. I know they're technically psychic types, so they can make themselves float and make other things float, but get serious here. Minior's in the same camp. There's a bit more to this one. It's got the shields down mechanic, so depending on how high its health is, it'll be in either the meteor form or the core form, but that's not enough to base a Smash moveset around, and even if you wanted to, it's a comeback mechanic. I just talked about those. There are so many in Smash already. There are so many better candidates in Pokemon. Magmortar. See, the problem here is a lot of the stuff that comes to mind for me, stuff like, oh, it could shoot fireballs out of its cannon hands for projectiles, and it could launch a steady stream of fire as like a rocket propulsion recovery move. Am I not just kind of talking about me Gunner there? I like the Heavy Zoner archetype, and Magmortar is a candidate for it, but it's facing a lot of competition and fire in particular is pretty oversaturated. I think I gotta go C tier. Now, to its credit, there is a very strong, clear gameplay direction here, and if either the Smash roster or the Pokemon roster were a lot different, this would probably be much higher, but as is, it doesn't interest me. Its counterpart, or what I think is supposed to be its counterpart, it's not a direct link, but they definitely do seem to be associated with each other. Electivire, this one's more interesting, if nothing else just because of its Pokedex entry. This one builds up charge in its horns and then lets it out by touching an opponent with its tail, so there's kind of an implied charge up limit-ish sort of mechanic going on there, and it's a good body shape that looks like it would fit into Smash pretty naturally, and we have plenty of small, fast electric types. Sort of bigger, bulkier one is in slightly shorter supply. Its actual moveset isn't crazy, but B tier. As for all the pre-evolutions, not only are they not particularly interesting compared to the fully evolved forms, but their body types actually directly don't facilitate the gimmicks I was talking about. Another Gen 1 that got an evolution way later. I'm just going to start by talking about Rhydon. Good design. I like it as far as it appears in Pokemon, and as a Smash candidate, it's a biped with a big tail and a horn, so it's kind of rocking that Reptar body shape again, except with the addition of a big horn on top of that. Now, its typing of ground and rock doesn't necessarily open up nearly the same kind of possibilities as someone like Feraligatr, but it could make good use of them, and I could definitely see it being a Pokemon that would stomp on the ground to create earthquakes and stuff like that. Okay, now I can talk about Rhyperior. What the fuck did they do? Rhydon was a perfectly nice, clean, functional design that they absolutely butchered down the road. I hate this thing so much. I really wish this one just never existed to begin with, especially because it really messes with the lineup, right? Because let's say you did want to have this evolution line in Smash. Rhydon isn't really significant enough that I think you could reasonably choose it over the evolution for any particular reason, unless you were doing another like Pokemon Trainer 2.0 deal, but in that case, please don't do Gen 1 again. I'm still gonna give it C tier because it's just a pretty natural fit, if not a bit of a boring one, but if Rhyperior never existed, it would probably be higher. And Rhyhorn isn't a terrible quadruped, but it definitely wouldn't work as an Echo Fighter. Dusknoir. Ghost is one of my favorite Pokemon types, and this is one of my favorite Ghost Pokemon. A big, bulky, physical Cyclops. That's awesome. To some degree, it does have the Haunter problem where it's a floater and its tail would need to drag out behind it, but it's got a much bigger, rounder body, and its trailing tail isn't anywhere near as significant a part of the design, so you could just have it just slightly off the ground and sort of cheat and put quote-unquote feet hurt boxes underneath it that aren't actually tied to anything, and I don't think it would register as too strange, and then the tail can be just kind of dragging along the ground. I got to admit though, I am trying to force it a bit, which I'm free to do. It's my video and I love this Pokemon, but I am taking that into account. It's no Houndoom. It could be so cool though. You could have all these slow, heavy elemental punches, and then it could use Leech Life, which it can learn, and it makes a lot of sense because again, this thing's a total tank of a Pokemon. You could use Pain Split, which equalizes the life tally between each Pokemon as kind of a combination of a counter and something like Robin's Nosferatu. I love the concept of a heavyweight ghost life manipulation Pokemon so much. But there's no getting around the body shape issue. It's a bit of a problem. See, if it looked more like Dusclops, that's an S tier right there. But it doesn't, which means Dusclops is not really compatible as an Echo Fighter, and frankly, I think it's a fraction as cool to begin with. And then Duskull is actually more compatible as an Echo Fighter, but it doesn't even have hands. Its ghost neighbor here on the tier list, Bannet. I think this is another case where you just leave it in the Mega Evolution form. Really love this design, and the lore behind it is cool. If Bannet opens its mouth, its cursed energy escapes. This is it with multiple open quote-unquote mouths. And if you wanted to go off the beaten path of existing Pokemon moves a bit, which they generally do in Smash, you could have it open its mouths wider to shoot out that cursed energy as a projectile that doesn't even need to have a name that's tied into a Pokemon move. And it's also the Marionette Pokemon, so it could have some really creepy, jerky, awkward animations to it, which would be so cool on a ghost type. So it's actually got quite a bit going for it, even outside of a pure gameplay context, but once we get into that, there's a bit of a direction too. Mega Bannet has the Prankster ability, which means that any of its status moves get priority as if it was using Quick Attack. So this could be a Pokemon with a lot of either dedicated status delivery moves like Will-O-Wisp or Icy Wind, or just a Pokemon who has multiple moves where a natural byproduct is, say, their forward smash lights their opponent on fire while their up smash freezes them, something like that. And then you could make Hex the centerpiece of their game plan, which deals additional damage and knockback if the opponent is afflicted with a status condition. A little bit like how Zetterburn from Rivals of Aether has strong attacks that do more damage and knockback if his opponent is on fire, except maybe Hex even gains different bonuses depending on which kind of status condition your opponent is afflicted interacted with. And this one can even float directly above the ground quite comfortably. It's got a great design, it's a ghost type, so it's definitely got the bias there, strong moveset direction, really fantastic animation potential. I have no complaints. I don't really see a reason to bring base level Bandit in. I think the Mega Evolution just does what it does but better, and then shop it as a blob. Speaking of blobs, Grimer and Muck. Okay, they're blobs of pollution that slowly move along the ground. Can you really see any of them jumping around in a platform fighter or really jumping at all? I like Alolan Muck, I used it in my Ultra Sun playthrough, but it's not a Smash fighter. You know who'd be great at jumping though? A cat. Please welcome Silentor to the channel to talk about his favorite.
My choice as a playable fighter for Smash 6 would go to Meowth. It is one of my all-time favorite Pokemon. It was always heartbreaking to see the little cat only being held captive in a Pokeball. I can see Meowth being a very movement and combo heavy type of fighter. Put Pikachu and Diddy Kong in a blender and out comes a perfectly balanced Meowth. A bit slower than Pikachu, slightly taller and a tad lighter than Diddy Kong. Meowth should feel very agile, like a cat should be. Meowth's main normal attacking moves are its claws, giving it more range compared to your typical brawler character like Mario, but still less range than a typical sword fighter. As for specials, I would 100% use its most unique move, Payday, as its neutral special. We already have a reference in Smash, so we just use that with less damage, but chargeable. Let's make use of its ability pickup for the down special slot. It can either get a Destiny Knot, a Bottle Cap or Heavy Nugget, increasing in damage and knockback. And if you like the thrill of gacha and feel extra spicy, give it a Golden Bottle Cap for extra damage and knockback. For side special, Feint looks like a great idea, looking similar to Zoroark in Pokémon Unite. It would give Meowth even a secondary recovery move. And talking about recoveries, let's not forget up special. As an up special, I would pick the hot air balloon shaped like a Meowth from Team Rocket trio in the anime. You gain more distance pumping more heat into it, but if you pump too much it goes bananas like Diddy's barrel. Theoretically, the hot air balloon would also make for an incredible Final Smash cinematic in Smash 6. Overall, I would put Meowth in A tier. It's one of the most iconic Pokemon from the anime and technically Pikachu's rival as well. I think you cannot go wrong with that.
Okay, Meowth has been treated weirdly over the years. I agree the base form Meowth is actually great. Let's start with the base form Persian. This is a normal type cat Pokemon that's just kind of a cat. It's the rare instance where I think its pre-evolution just wildly outshines it, right? Sure, the series' first boss character got a Persian, but Meowth got given one of the biggest recurring roles on the show for decades at a time. It has basically nothing to offer that other quadrupeds don't. I'm gonna put it in D tier instead of F just because it's functional, it's not disqualified or anything, but why? Still better than the Alolan Persian though. I'm just at a total loss for how this happened. Hey, you know, Meowth's cool, but what if we want to branch out from the normal type a bit? Let's give it a dark variant. Ooh. And that also finally gives us a chance to make Persian cooler, which has been getting upstaged by his pre-evolution for over 20 years. And what we ended up with was Persian through an Instagram filter with a watermelon bolted onto its neck. How did this happen? It's a shame because Dark Meowth makes a lot of sense, and I think you could make a really good Echo Fire out of it compared to base level Meowth. You would just need to change a couple of moves around to reflect the dark typing. I think the devs kind of knew with this one because next generation, Meowth got another chance. Now, unlike Alolan Meowth, I'm not really a fan of the design of Galarian Meowth. It looks less like the young Viking thing they're going for and more just like a misshapen blob. But then we get to Berserker, the evolved form, and this one hooks me back in. It's pure steel type, you can have it attack with those horns on its head, with Viking-inspired animations and a lot of metal claw moves. I still think out of this ridiculous number of variants, the one I would actually still prefer is just base level Meowth, but very solid B tier for Berserker. I would definitely take it. Its typing is definitely more interesting, and in-game it has more to pull from, but Meowth has decades of source material from the show, right? That's gotta give it a boost. As for Galarian Meowth, it's also steel type. It doesn't have the horns, so you would need to change some head moves around. It's not interesting to me, but you could make it work. The elemental monkeys, Simisage, Simisear, Simipour. Like I said, I skipped Gen 5. I know these are very controversial Pokemon. I don't 100% understand why. They don't seem that bad to me. I know there was a huge Japanese poll done a little while back which put Simisear as the least popular Pokemon in the entire country, and I'm not saying it's a home run or anything, and the fact that there's a starter who's also a fire monkey with a way better design is not helping its case, but it's also a series full of absolute nothings of Pokemon. I don't know, I don't get it. The main issue for me with these is they're very blatantly a trio. Having any of them represented individually would just feel bizarre, and then I don't know who's asking for a Pokemon trainer using the 3 elemental monkeys or anything like that. These are all like D tiers, and the thing is, if only one of them existed, it might be placed higher. The body shape's perfectly fine. Pansage, Pansear, and Panpour are ones I'm struggling a little bit with for the placement because By the strictest definition, they would actually be really good Echo Fighters if you wanted to have the evolved trio in there, but for the most part, I've been treating the good Echo Fighter tier as one where I would actually want to see the Pokemon in it too. More monkeys, Apom and Ambipom. Ambipom is a normal type, so it has less moveset potential compared to the elemental monkeys, but its body shape is way more fun with the double tails, and also, importantly, it's not part of a trio. It's free to just do its own thing. And I think that could be kind of cool. Yeah, there's obviously a lot of potential there to just like slap people with the tails, but you could also have it moving around with its tails and attacking with its smaller limbs individually. I think B tier, it's not amazing, but it definitely works. And then Apom just used the evolution. It's one tail versus two tails, so you would need to radically change the moveset. We're coming across that one sword versus two swords thing again. Diggersby is actually kind of in the same camp, funny enough. It's a rabbit with ears that are giant grappling arms. It actually reminds me quite a bit of Cerebella from Skullgirls, who has a pretty fun moveset. I'm not giving Diggersby credit for that. I'm not saying you could just slap her moveset on it, especially because, weirdly enough, Diggersby doesn't actually canonically know that many grapple style moves. A bit of a weird choice. Moveset potential wise, Diggersby I think is a little bit below Ambipom, and also personality wise in terms of animations and stuff I think is way below, and Ambipom was already kind of a like halfway point between B and C for me, so C tier is fine. For Bunnelby, the arm ear things are starting to come in already, but they're not really developed enough in the same way. Just use Diggersby. And then I'm kind of pulled between flowing back to monkeys or flowing into more rabbits. Why don't we just do both and talk about the Gen 8 starters here? Let's do Cinderace. This was the starter I went with in Shield. Design-wise, in terms of just how well I like it as a Pokemon, it's okay. It's not my all-time favorite. Pure Fire could definitely be mistaken for firefighting, but I think people were getting sick of it by that point. As far as being a Smash contender goes, though, it actually works quite well. First off, its body shape obviously just kind of plops right into Smash, no problem, and it's also got an extremely clear moveset and animation direction because it's a soccer Pokemon. Its neutral special, yeah, that's Pyro Ball, where it kicks a burning ball at you. Could give it a timing-based element, like it's shown up in a lot of fighting games, but use Donatello from Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 for reference. Or for a slightly looser one in terms of function, but probably closer to the physics, Wii Fit Trainer's Header, which, yes, technically is some soccer overlap already in Smash, but it's really not that bad. And then you obviously give it a lot of rabbit attacks, Bounce comes to mind, and a lot of other kicking attacks. It's a fast Pokemon who would be based around approaching behind flaming soccer balls launched at all sorts of different angles. Like I've said, fire types are very saturated, but it's just so screamingly obvious how Cinderace would fit into Smash. It's not my all-time favorite starter personally, it's good enough, but from a pure compatibility standpoint, which in theory is basically all this video is supposed to be, it's so good. Scorbunny, technically speaking, doesn't really have quite the same full-on soccer theming as Cinderace does, but I think that's okay. You could stretch that a bit. Good Echo Fighter. And then Raboot turns into what I think is supposed to be a ninja for a little while, although it's still just called the rabbit Pokemon. Yeah, middle evolution syndrome. It's technically fine. You could absolutely make all three of them work if you wanted to, but you're not going to. Rillaboom. Obviously some very surface level comparisons to DK going on here, but I don't think you make this one a grappler at all. It needs to carry its drum around with it, and I think that would make for a hilarious weapon. Less of a sword fighter and more of a giant club fighter. It would actually have two weapons. It would have the drum and then the drumstick, and depending on what kind of attack you were doing, faster ones would use the drumstick and heavier ones would use the drum. Rillaboom's Grassy Surge ability creates grass terrain when it enters the battlefield. You know what that sounds very comparable to? Is Sylvanos from Rivals of Aether, who generates grass when he walks around. You obviously couldn't take it to the same degree as in Rivals of Aether. Those kinds of stage controlling elements are par for the course, whereas they're quite rare in Smash, but some kind of planting or terraforming mechanic could be really cool to see. Maybe he beats his drum and that creates like a nature song that brings grass up that offers him some kind of benefit. Wait, it knows Grassy Glide, which would just be a burst movement option, and then in Pokemon it gets priority on grassy terrain. This is just Sylvanos' B-Stash. Screw it, just make it Sylvanos, we're done here. And Sylvanos is awesome, S tier. Thwackey I'm gonna give functional Echo Fighter 2 because it's holding two sticks instead of a stick and a drum. You could almost make that work though. Its drum-based attacks would be faster and that could be kind of the differentiating factor. And obviously any attacks where Rillaboom is properly beating the drum, Thwackey would just be hitting two sticks together and getting more of a clack. But that's okay. That's actually kind of cool and thematically appropriate for an Echo Fighter. Like I said, with other starters, you'd probably go for Grookey instead, but it's got one stick. It doesn't really work. And then we get to Inteleon, who out of the three Gen 8 starters, I think definitely has the most awkward body shape. It's really skinny, which makes sense for its overall theming in Pokemon. It's got like a sharpshooter kind of thing going on. A sniper in Smash who's fast and skinny and impossible to hit. That doesn't sound super pleasant. This one I think gets dropped down to B tier. It's got a clear direction to follow at least, and it does get the starter boost, but this seems like by far the least fitting out of the three. Probably not that much fun to fight against. So we'll just use the evolution. Some parts would translate over okay, but my main issue with it is its arms and legs are very short, whereas Inteleon's are very long and skinny, and it would obviously use those for some attacks. Drizzle, I'm gonna do the same. You could probably make this one work. It's definitely a lot closer, and the smaller limbs, shorter limbs thing could be the differentiating factor, but why would you want to? Another Gen 8 Pokemon who's a lot of fun if nothing else. Phalanx. Just a bunch of little guys marching around and forming themselves up in different ways. Completely impractical for Smash, but comedy tier. We're having fun here. Hey, you remember Hugh? The guy who dropped a bunch of the biggest Smash Ultimate videos ever made and then won a Nintendo tournament? And then peaced out? I coaxed him out of hibernation for a bit. He's here to get us back on track with more serious Pokemon.
I don't know much about Pokemon, but I think this Pokemon is one of the coolest designs in video game history. I'm talking about Klefki. I was looking at Pokemons that have the worst designs, and this was the first thing that popped up. I don't know how it's gonna fight in Smash. I don't know how it's even gonna move. Does this thing just float around? I guess it does, but this is my vote. I think this is gonna be one of the most inspirational adds into Smash. Okay, bye.
Speaking of dumbass piece of crap metal object Pokemon, the Kling line. They're just gears. Like, am I missing something here? They're just gears. I'm not generally a big fan of this is an object Pokemon, but these have to be some of the worst examples. Get them out of here. Look at the Magnemite line, for example, the line that Clang is ripping off because Gen 5, of course. Are they the most brilliant Pokemon design ever made? No, and I don't really understand why when three of them are coming together, they're not connected magnetically, but at the very, very minimum, it is at least a few different objects stuck together in a visually interesting way, whereas Clang is literally just gears with eyes. And then the evolution, Magnezone, the more interesting one, is something genuinely different. Does that make it a good Smash candidate? No. Its body shape is totally wrong. These all hover off the ground. It does have a defined niche as a Pokemon that traps other steel Pokemon, but that's not really applicable to Smash. I mean, they're getting F tier, but, you know, they can stay in the series. Roserade, Grass Poison, which does directly compete against Ivysaur. The body type is totally different, and there is definitely some potential there. I'm still looking for the big, I'm a grass type, I do grass things Pokemon, and this one's getting closer. It learns a lot of the essential moves, your Giga Drains, your Grass Knots, but it's feeling like more of a B tier. Extremely functional Pokemon, but the body type, while it works well, doesn't necessarily lend itself to the most incredible playstyle, and like I said, Ivysaur's a thing. Rosalia would make a really good Echo Fighter, Budew not so much. Also, I think this is the last straw in terms of rating inferior forms of mid-tiers above those mid-tiers. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna drop good Echo Fighter down, and functional Echo Fighter along with it. Yeah, let's just do this. Let's group all the Echo Fighter stuff together here. Hawlucha couldn't actually be an Echo Fighter of Incineroar, that's not how it works, but you could almost see it, right? They're both wrestler Pokemon. This is the Luchador. It would have a more high-flying fighting style. I think B tier. Don't get me wrong, it's hard outcompeted by Incineroar, but if Incineroar never existed, it could be a reasonable candidate. On the topic of Pokemon that already exist, anyone order an electric mouse? Oh, I'm sorry, electric fairy mouse, because that makes such an enormous difference. Yeah, the only reason I really remember Dedenne existing at all is because in the card game, it was a really stable Pokemon for a long time, entirely because it was a one-card draw engine. That's essentially it. Every Pokemon generation seems to need a Pikachu, but Smash already has 2 Pikachus, and I advocated for 4 Pikachus. We don't need a 5th Pikachu. Or a 6th. Hey, TierZoo. I mean, Squovin and Greedent are just stupid squirrels too, but at the very least, they're not electric type, and they're so audacious about their designs that I actually kind of respect it. You can have comedy tier. Meryl was the original, also a Pikachu, but you know, it was Gen 2, they could get away with it a bit more, and to this day, it's still doing something more unique than a lot of them. Yeah, sure, it's a mouse, but it's a water fairy mouse, and it turns into a water fairy rabbit. Azumarill's the interesting one here. It's actually shockingly powerful. It learns Belly Drum, which gives up a giant chunk of its health in exchange for maximizing its attack stat, and it has the ability Huge Power, which just straight up doubles its attack stat, and I want all of that brought in and just make Azumarill a pure aggro character, the glass cannon to end all glass cannons, and you could enforce that aggro playstyle by having Belly Drum work not too dissimilarly to how it does in Pokemon. You activate it as a special move and you take a bunch of damage and it gives you a huge power boost, but one that's only active for a certain amount of time, and you don't give Azumarill any projectiles, so it has to go in. It sounds, let's be honest about this, kind of toxic, but the fun kind of toxic. It would be a nightmare to balance, but assuming you could, let's go B tier. Marill, I think I'm going to go good Echo Fighter because huge power isn't the only ability Azumarill or Marill can learn, so you could just have it be the more balanced version, right? Take away Belly Drum and lower its offensive stats overall and give it some corresponding buffs. It could work. Azurill, the baby version, is almost there, and it would be fun to introduce a move or two where it bounces around on its tail. Give it that instead of Belly Drum if it's the down special, for example, but I think Marill's the stronger choice, and more importantly, Azurill doesn't have arms. Another Gen 2 with no arms, Murkrow. It's got flappy wings instead. Same with its evolution Honchkrow. Now, this one is like a big barrel-chested mob boss Pokemon, so you could definitely see it lounging around on the ground a bit more, but it's still portrayed as flying. Crabrawler. This is a boxing Pokemon, and I've already talked about Hitmonchan and how that space is kind of crowded out by Little Mac. Obviously a very different body shape here that does kind of work. It does definitely stand out a bit more, and I just like Crabrawler. It's a fun design from Gen 7. I'm gonna give it C tier, way above Hitmonchan. It's got so much more personality, it's more distinct, more fun, could still work at least acceptably well. And then we get to Crabominable. You carry Crabrawler around with you for ages, you don't get to evolve it until you scale a summit really late into the game, and this thing pops out. I have never felt this betrayed by a video game. You know what? While we're taking Pokemon out of Pokemon, Licky Licky, a truly repulsive mess. I am definitely going to call it a downgrade over Lickitung, its pre-evolution, but not a sharp downgrade. This wasn't exactly one of Gen 1's shining moments to begin with. The thing is, there actually is a pretty reasonable moveset design direction for these guys, but I don't care. I'm not going to bat for them. And alright, Lickitung can at least stay in Pokemon. That's the best I can do. I think I'm just in slash and burn mode here. What is this thing? Aromatisse. It's creeping me out, and I think it's supposed to be based on a Plague Doctor and their good vibes scents that they use instead of real medicine. And yeah, Plague Doctors are inherently creepy, they're a common horror motif, but this isn't even really that kind of creepy. It's more of an I'm questioning the artist's tastes and sensibilities kind of creepy. This is hideous and not particularly interesting. What is it doing here? Silicobra and Sandaconda. As I've mentioned, snakes aren't exactly starting out in a position of power on this list, and then you take an exceptionally awkward body shape and coil it up on itself so that it moves awkwardly even in its native series, and then while the concept of compressing its coils to blow sand out of its nose is creative, I guess. That's the Pokemon's whole identity that would work for maybe 2 moves in Smash, and then we're stuck with this ugly sausage we're trying to build the rest of the moveset around. Not only could Sandaconda not really do anything in Smash, but it's also by far one of my least favorite Gen 8 Pokemon. I think Silicobra deserved a better evolution. Okay, I've heard some more low tiers. Let's bring in EE to talk about an actually cool Pokemon.
You know, honestly, I don't find it particularly difficult to explain why I think Heracross would be the perfect addition to the Super Smash Bros. Series. I mean, look at this guy. He is just a tank of brute force, big body, which means he's gonna get a little slow, but don't worry, I've got a moveset to kind of compensate for that and help him out a little bit. Let's start first with his up air, okay? Obviously, a lot of his attacks are gonna be based on that huge horn. I'm thinking that up air is gonna have crazy KO potential, something like a Fox's up air, actually, when you really think about it, maybe even Pyra from Aegis. How about down air, right? Just the ability to just spike is gonna cover a lot of ground too. Again, that horn is gonna be leaned on heavily, but how about his special attacks? For a neutral special, how about we do Bullet Seed, right? It'll kind of mirror Mega Man's pellets, and it'll be annoying and disruptive, but not overpowered. A side special, Mega Horn. I think the ability to use Mega Horn would be pretty cool. Again, it's a signature of that horn he has, and you can even charge it up too, so maybe you can get some early KOs on the lighter cast. I'm thinking his down special should be counter, right? Again, he's a big body, might be a little bit slower, but how about off that counter too? It kind of pumps up what he's able to do as well, right? Kind of give a little boost, kind of take a little inspiration from Incineroar in that regard. And an up special, keep it simple. You can angle it too. It'll just be like fly. You know what I mean? He's got those big wings on his back, so we want to take full advantage of that. And if we want to go down the route of his special, I'm talking about that ultimate attack, that Super Smash transforming badassery. Mega Heracross, and you can let your imagination run wild from there.
And then Pinsir, who I think is kind of the original Heracross. There's a lot of parallels between these two. Also a very strong design. In some ways, I would say even stronger than Heracross. Those horns are a really distinctive, interesting design element that you could use. Its limbs aren't as well set up for it, though. That does limit what it can do a bit more, and while its horns are interesting compared to Heracross, which has a more standard one, I don't think they lend themselves to as diverse a move pool as Heracross can get out of it. Yeah, you can do more Vice Grip style moves and stuff like that, but in terms of headbutting from different angles, I think Heracross has the edge. I really like them both, and I think you could definitely make them both work. Heracross is the overall stronger option, though. I think A tier instead of S for Pinsir. Togedemaru. This is Pikachu again. You're not fooling me with that steel typing. Look at these. Absolutely shameless. Certainly a more interesting group of Gen 7 Pokemon, the Guardian Deities. Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, Tapu Fini. See, on an individual basis, I really like all these designs. There's definitely a lot of diversity between them, and I love the fact that they can transform essentially into various animal-shaped masks. The deeper I get into the list, though, the more I'm starting to sour on these linked legendaries, because I really don't like the idea of just choosing one, and I also don't necessarily love the idea of bringing all four of them in. Now, you could, an island trainer, a Gen 7 trainer could be interesting that used all four of them, but even then, if you're going to take that approach, aren't there other Alolan Pokemon you might want to make use of more? I mean, Tapu Koko does play the largest role in the Sun and Moon games, and it is maybe the strongest option. It's electric type, which is definitely an overcrowded option, but all of the Tapus are associated with creating different terrain types, electric terrain in this case, which I think has a lot of potential for synergy with the moveset. Tapu Bulu creates grassy terrain, which, as I've already covered, I think Rillaboom would do better. Tapu Fini creates misty terrain, and Tapu Lele creates psychic terrain. I just don't really think either of those lend themselves as obviously to Smash as electric terrain, where it's like, yeah, you have an electric field around yourself that powers up your moves kind of deal. That at least makes sense. You could have some kind of conduction system even. I think I'm just going to give them all B tier and call it a day. They're cool Pokemon. They're relatively important to their generation. There is definitely a distinct identity there. They're also really weird to work with. Tapu Koko coming in as a standalone fighter with the others appearing in the final Smash. It's not the worst thing in the world, but its signature Z move is already a perfectly good final Smash without needing to involve any of the others. Not to say that you couldn't. Smash is no stranger to total blowout, stuff like that, so I'm going to keep all of the Tapus bundled together, but for the record, Tapu Koko could also work as a standalone B tier fighter. Another quadruple set of legendaries, the Treasures of Ruin from Gen 9. These have the same problem where I think you need to group them up to really feel complete, and there are some additional issues on top of that. Ting-Lu has a body shape that could work for Smash. Xianpao has a body shape that could work for Smash. I don't think it's nearly as good. I really like it as a standalone Pokemon. It's probably my favorite of the four designs. I love that concept of the icicle-ridden sword being shoved into its mouth as its fangs. But in terms of how it could actually use it to fight in Smash, you're kind of looking at a Zacian-like thing, except it's lower to the ground, and those swords are always stuck sticking straight down, so there's really actually quite awkward, cramped angles you're working around there. And then the other two, Chi-Yu, well, that's just a fish. And Wo-Xian, it's not nearly as bad. It's not has its own tier for just how incompatible it is with Smash levels of bad, but picture this thing jumping around Battlefield. I don't think you really can. The signature move they all share is Ruination, which halves the health of their target. That doesn't translate super cleanly into Smash. You'd need to take some pretty heavy liberties. Their signature abilities emit an aura that cuts a stat for everyone else. That kind of has something to work with in Smash, but it's not that great either. I think I have to rank them collectively, and I'm going C tier. That's mainly out of respect for how these two designs at least kind of work, and if you wanted to make like an old-timey Pokemon trainer that fought with these four, you kind of could. This is the defensive one, so you can picture it coming out just to deal a few defensive moves, but even then, I'm probably being a bit too generous. Realistically, I really like this set of legendaries as they work in Pokemon, so there's probably a bit of bias going on there too. This is definitely the best I can do though. Gimme Ghoul. Putting the base version of this in Smash is like putting a Korok in Smash. I'm not even going to entertain it. So that means you would need to use the chest form, which is how it actually fights, and there's something there. It could swing the chest around as a weapon and stuff like that. It's not that good though, and if we're going down the coin-themed Pokemon route, I think Meowth just wildly outperforms it. It barely even has a moveset, which makes sense, right? It's supposed to be more of an environmental interactable than anything else. It evolves into Goldango though, which is a repulsive looking Pokemon, definitely one of my least favorite Gen 9 designs, but it has a body type that does work. It can spawn a surfboard for itself, so that's kind of a fun way of moving around. Its signature ability just soaks up status effects, which I know it's pretty good in the competitive scene, but that's not really translatable to Smash in any interesting way. I'm going to give the Black Diamond Cheese String D tier instead of F, and frankly, quite a bit of that is just because of the surfboard thing. Even then though, right, it's competing against Squirtle. and against Alolan Raichu. And its signature move is directly competing against Meowth. Yeah, it's just like a really ugly version of a lot of existing Smash and Pokemon things. Gimmighoul, absolutely not. The Staraptor line, definitely one of the most beloved regional birds, but those wings are looking pretty flappy to me. Sandygast and Palossand in comparison, extremely grounded Pokemon. Too grounded as a matter of fact. This is another case like Muck where it's like, okay, they're fun, I kind of like what they're doing here, but can you actually see these moving around a Smash stage? That's an F tier. A ground Pokemon that I think works a lot better, Marowak. Let's see if Odyssey Central agrees, a channel that does tons of these Nintendo rankings.
Marowak is one of the lucky Pokemon to have a pretty clear weapon that a moveset can be based around. The large bone that it wields would essentially turn him into a sword fighter the size of Pikachu. On top of just basic swings of the bone, Marowak would of course have to incorporate Bone Meringue, one of the Marowak line's signature moves. This could be implemented by either having Marowak throw small bones, similar to Dry Bones in Super Mario World, or he could throw his main bone forward, similar to Pyra's Blazing End. I'd also love to see the fire from Marowak's Alolan form implemented in some way. Maybe the flames could be added to his smash attacks to really emphasize their strength. Due to Marowak's pretty clear moveset potential, I think it deserves to be an A tier.
And I think I'm going to put Cubone in functional Echo Fighter instead of good Echo Fighter. Yeah, of course it would work. It's basically the same Pokemon as Marowak, and that's kind of the problem. It's not really bringing that much new stuff to the table. Marowak, as Odyssey Central said, is a small sword fighter, so Cubone being a slightly smaller sword fighter. Although, you know what? There is no Alolan Cubone, so maybe you take the fire element of it away, and that's the difference. That's good enough. All right, good Echo Fighter. And then why don't we do a pair of guest segments and appropriately bring in Vars?
Alrighty, so the Pokemon that I chose to add to this series is Gallade. I'm a huge fan of pairs in the main series Pokemon games, Latios and Latias, Espeon and Umbreon, Gardevoir and Gallade, Nidoking and Nidoqueen, Plusle and Minun, Zangoose and Seviper, although those two hate each other, but you get the point. Seeing as how Gardevoir is already an instantiable Pokemon, I opted for another Pokemon that looks like it could have a really nifty moveset. I know it's another Swordy, just hear me out. The shining feature of Gallade is its proficiency in different elemental slash attacks, as evident by receiving the new Sharpness ability in Scarlet and Violet, along with an extensive repertoire of cutting attacks: Night Slash, Aqua Cutter, Sacred Sword, Leaf Blade, Fury Cutter, Air Slash, Psycho Cut, X Scissor, Shadow Claw, and so on. Being a psychic fighting type raises interesting questions, where it can specialize in a combination of physical and magic attacks in a manner of speaking, almost like Robin. For its hypothetical neutral special, I think I want to give him a physical attack, Vacuum Wave, allowing Gallade to launch a lightning fast punch at his opponent that trades damage and kill power for speed. I had half a mind to give it the same properties as Joker's gun, where it's technically not a projectile despite having very long range, and it applies hit stun when close enough. Don't worry though, I'm not giving it a downward variant. For its size special, I want to make that one Night Slash, and make it his burst movement option of choice, disappearing before reappearing and striking kind of like Meta Knight's Dimension Cape or Greninja's Shadow Sneak, but only horizontally. With Night Slash also having increased crit chance, it can have a tipper sweet spot where the farther he uses it, the more damage it can do, or it can be a center sweet spot where if he appears right next to his opponent, it does a lot more damage. Now, I'm not really sure what moveslot I want to fit this into, but I also do want to give him Brick Break as sort of a shield pressure tool. I'm surprised they didn't give that to any of the existing Pokemon characters, but if Gallade were to ever be introduced, I want him to be a more tactical sword fighter with a mixture of close range, mid-range, and long-range pressure, as well as some utility options to highlight the psychic portion of his identity. Maybe have down special be Psycho Cut, a ranged attack that can absorb projectiles mid-flight and add it to its own power. Almost like Revenge turned into a projectile, so if you expect a Samus to throw a charge shot at you, you can use Psycho Cut. It's a projectile that eats other projectiles. For the most part, I want to give him all kinds of different attacks for his normals, finding some way to incorporate Air Slash, Leaf Blade, X Scissor, Fury Cutter, and the like, although maybe I might be a little too ambitious and that might come off as like Fighters Pass 3 stuff. I could go on and on about this, but I'd rather not take 40 minutes, so I'll just leave it at that. Give us a Pokemon Sword fighter, Nintendo, please.
Yeah, and for the record, if there was any channel on YouTube that was my pair, it would probably be Vars3, his Smash channel. There's been more than one case where we've been literally working on the exact same video topic at the same time. As for Gardevoir, this is an all-time fan favorite Pokemon to the extent that if you actually did make that Pokemon Trainer 2.0 with 3 different Pokemon from different generations that weren't starters, it would legitimately make the shortlist. Its body type would drop right into Smash. It would have these graceful, flowing, ethereal movements. It's Psychic Fairy type and obviously a special attacker, so it could use a lot of beam style weapons and things like that. There is definitely some overlap here. The frail psychic type, that's directly competing against Mewtwo, even if Gardevoir is also fairy type and wouldn't be doing the same kind of physical attacks. That flowing, graceful, floaty thing, well, that's kind of Rosalina. So for me personally, this is kind of an A tier alongside Gallade, but because it's so popular and such an actual proper realistic pick, I'll give it the bump up into S. I like Gardevoir a fair amount as well. I use it on my Pokemon Legends Arceus team. And then we get to Iron Valiant, kind of a combination of Gardevoir and Gallade. Now, this would probably take too much work for an Echo Fighter. That said, It's pretty awesome in its own right. It's got like a detachable double-bladed staff. It's fairy fighting type, a combination of Gallade and Gardevoir. Yeah, screw it, S tier. I would actually take this over Gardevoir personally. Another really strong Gen 3 Paradox Pokemon pair, we've got Hariyama and Iron Hands. Hariyama kind of speaks for itself. A sumo wrestler Pokemon? Yeah, that's great. Obviously, you make it a grappler and give it a lot of throws and a lot of shove type moves maybe. Or, you know, just make it E-Honda. I would probably actually be kind of disappointed if there wasn't at least a loose E-Honda reference on there. Iron Hands is potentially really interesting too though, because it's still a sumo wrestler, and all of the Iron Paradox Pokemon are associated with electric terrain. So what if it had the ability to create an electric sumo ring? If it got in close range of its opponent and fulfilled certain conditions of some kind, it could force them into a really confined space for a second or two. That's a dynamic that really only exists in Smash right now with Steve block placements. I think Hariyama and Iron Hands are both getting S tier. I'd be so happy with either of them. And then even Makahita, the pre-evolution, really good Echo Fighter candidate. Escavalier. This is kind of Beedrill, isn't it? Wait, it's Gen 5 again! Okay, it is Steel type, so it's got its own thing going on, but come on, this is the same body shape as Beedrill, upstaged. As for Carablast, it's just kind of a little nothing bug. Wait, it's another Pikachu? Okay, we're making a Pikachu tier below F tier. This is actually starting to piss me off now. Shinx is veering dangerously far in that direction, but you know what? It comes back and sticks the landing. Luxray is a bit of an oddity. It looks to me like it should be electric dark, but it's just pure electric type, and also it's not actually that fast, but it is very physically offensive. I think that carves out its niche in the typing pretty well. Can easily picture it throwing itself into you with Wild Charge, and then it learns all of the different elemental fang attacks. I think there are stronger quadruped candidates out there, but it's a solid B. Helps that Shinx would make a pretty good Echo Fighter, and then Luxio's got middle evolution syndrome pretty bad. Wishy-Washy. That schooling mechanic when you're at high health that turns into a single Wishy-Washy when you're at low health, that's kind of an interesting dynamic. The opposite of a comeback mechanic. If only Smash took place underwater. Barbaracle. This is a disgusting Pokemon. I think the core idea of the design's kind of cool, but I hate how it's been executed. That said, most shell-based Pokemon couldn't really function in Smash that well. This is a significant exception. It lends itself to being a slow heavyweight grappler, very much like Machamp, arguably more so though because even its head is a hand. So this is definitely where you bring Clamp into the picture. It would also be a great fit for Razor Shell. It could use Shell Smash as a time-based all-out attack style move, kind of an extreme version of Shulk's Buster Art and Smash Art put together where it dishes out a ton of damage and knockback, but at the same time, Barbaracle becomes extremely vulnerable while it's active. I hate putting it in S tier because of how hideous it is, but yeah, this is an S tier. Binacle's not supposed to be all there yet, and it shows. Shieldar and Cloyster are a good example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Technically speaking, they're not floppy fish, but actually, yes, they are. They really need to be in the water. Clamperl, same deal, and I actually totally forgot to bring it up when I was talking about Huntail and Gorebyss. Who remembers Clamperl? Lotad, Lombre, Ludicolo. They're kind of fun Pokemon, but their whole thing is that rain dish above their head, which is why they have the rain dish ability. Their weather Pokemon are just way too inextricably tied to their identities. Morpeko. Are you a Pikachu? I don't think I'm willing to say that. It's more like Mimikyu. It's a design that's sort of playing off the concept of being a Pikachu. Half the time it's electric type, and half the time it's dark type. And it just changes at the end of every turn. Now, I will say that I think the mechanics actually miss out on the flavor a bit here. In Pokemon, it just transforms at the end of every turn. But these are supposed to be full belly mode and hangry mode. So it's like, oh, I'm full and satisfied or hungry and angry. But the act of actually eating food never really factors into it. Having said that though, you could translate this kind of thing into Smash pretty comfortably. It's an involuntary change, so just have it be an involuntary change. Maybe every time it lands a hit it transforms, or, you know, ends a combo it transforms, or it just does it periodically and you can't do anything about that. That said, half the time it's straight up Pikachu, and I don't think the mechanic is brilliant. And maybe if the shifting was a bit more mechanically satisfying in Pokemon, which, you know, isn't strictly speaking necessary for a Smash translation, but it is definitely more inspiring. Then this C tier would probably be a different story. There's definitely a lot of potential with this idea, but I don't think Morpeko is necessarily how you want it delivered. Altaria. So this is my favorite dragon type Pokemon. I love how it plays with the theming while still looking like it belongs to it. Perish Song is one of my all-time favorite Pokemon moves. I think it's so cool, but I can't lie to myself. It's dragon flying, which, yeah, of course it is. It's Flappy Wings. Latios and Latias are in the same camp. In this case, they're not actually flying type, they're Dragon Psychic. But look at them, they're not supposed to be crawling around on the ground on those little stumps, they're supposed to be zipping around at Mach speed. Their wings aren't that flappy, but they're still wings. Same deal with Lugia, might as well just crush all the legendaries' hopes and dreams while we're at it. Now, this one works better. Admittedly, it has more like hand wings than just pure wings, but try to picture this thing crawling around, it's just creepy. I'm giving it Flappy Wings. I know some people might advocate for a bit of a boost here. It's a super popular Pokemon. It's one of my girlfriend's favorites. Its body shape just doesn't work, and for me personally, it's not getting any kind of bias bump. It could have kind of a cool built-in Echo Fighter with Shadow Lugia, even though it doesn't appear on this tier list, but it's not really fixing any fundamental problems. Ho-Oh doesn't fare any better. I really like Ho-Oh. This one hurts. Not as much as with Articuno, though, my favorite ice type of all time. And I've got to do the same for the entire original legendary trio. They're Galarian forms. Galarian Moltres just traditionally flies around, so it's gotta go into Flappy Wings. The others actually don't, though. Galarian Articuno's official artwork has it crossing its wings, and that's actually because in-game, it's a psychic type and it hovers around, and you could have it hover just barely off the ground pretty comfortably. Its standard pose almost suggests that. The Pokedex talks about its feather-like blades that can shear through iron, so it could be kind of almost a bit of a sword fighter deal, or at least brawler, and then it fires off a lot of psychic and ice beam attacks as well. And then Galarian Zapdos isn't really as conceptually interesting, but it obviously has a very strong moveset direction with powerful kicks and pecks. Its signature move, Thunderous Kick, lowers the target's defense, so it could be like a shield break move. The thing about Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres is you do absolutely need to package the three of them together. You could. Moltres fits in there really awkwardly, but if you wanted to do a Galarian Pokemon trainer where each move is a different attack, you know, it could come in for up special or something like that. Galarian Articuno is actually a pretty decent candidate by itself, but you can't have it by itself. So you know what, it brings the others up with it. There's something there. Garganical. This one's kind of fun. Rock Salt Pokemon, pure rock typing, just a big bulky rock thing. It learns Salt Cure, which deals damage over time, especially to water and steel types. That obviously has no application, and again, damage over time is something I'd generally rather say for the poison types, and other than that, it does rock stuff. That's basically it. There are better heavyweights, there are better rock heavyweights, but it's kind of a fun design and functional. I don't think we need to see it more than once though. But while we're talking about I'm a rock Pokemon, Golem's been around since the beginning as the textbook example of that, even though it's dual rock ground typing, which I think actually makes you more rocky. Its design direction is pretty clear. It throws rocks at you, it rolls into a ball and charges at you, probably with armor on it. It smashes into the ground to cause earthquakes and stuff like that. Alolan Golem has a railgun on it that fires electrically charged rocks, which is not that substantial a difference, and it's awkward and I don't really like it, and you would need to give up a lot of rolling type moves, unless those prongs are retractable, which in Pokemon I actually don't know if they are or not. Kind of a moot point for me though, because the Pokedex says that because it can't fire rocks very fast, sometimes it just gets frustrated and grabs a Geodude and shoots those instead, and that's comedy. I care about that way more than anything else it's doing. As for the original Golem, that's an A tier. It's such an obvious representative for its typing, and it's also known as being a very common like exploder self-destruct kind of Pokemon in previous generations. As for the pre-evolutions, none of them really work body shape wise, and Graveler in particular, I've just never liked how it looks. Geodude I'm more of a fan of, but it's just not compatible. Wooloo, very different roly-poly thing. Okay, apart from rolling around, there's basically no moveset potential there whatsoever, but it's Wooloo. As for Dubwool, its evolution, not as funny, and then it's just kind of Tauros or Gogoat at home, which I was not big on to begin with. I'm in a good mood, I'll put it alongside Gogoat. Let's get something with a bit more substance. TierZoo's coming back on to talk about his favorite Pokemon, and actually one of my favorite Gen 3 Pokemon, who I always thought deserved a bit better. Also, as a side note, I just asked the guest to submit audio. The animated demos that he provided are all him, and when I first brought this up, he showed me notes for other characters he was already coincidentally doing this for as a design exercise, so yeah, this is very much in his wheelhouse.
Sup everybody, Patch from TierZoo here to represent my all-time favorite Pokemon, the Gen 3 Grass Flying type, Tropius. Luckily, trying to conceptualize a moveset for a leafy banana dinosaur with wings is not too difficult, as all of its defining features already have representation somewhere else in Smash. Its wings and flying type make it pretty obvious Tropius would have the ability to double jump multiple times, similar to Pit or Charizard, and its grass type attacks could easily be slight variations on Ivysaur's special attacks, maybe replacing Bullet Seed and Razor Leaf with Air Slash and Magical Leaf. But most importantly, Tropius could finally be the character to end the monopoly on banana peels that Diddy Kong has had since Brawl. Tropius' down special is the move Natural Gift, which drops a random helpful berry-themed item from Tropius' neck. This could be a banana peel, turnip, food item, or even a healing field or banana gun if you're lucky. The only drawback would be a long recharge time. Although zoner heavyweights tend to be kinda mid in Smash, I would hope that the utility of the banana peel and the healing potential of its food items would be enough to break Tropius out of its lackluster competitive battling record and land itself in a higher tier spot.
Volcanion. This is an interesting legendary. It's a quadruped, but it's a very upright quadruped. I think its body shape would actually fit in pretty well. Dual fire and water typing, which, as I've been over, have competition in Smash already, but that combination is so distinct and interesting. It's like a steam-based character. That's pretty unique, actually. There's a lot of moveset potential there that doesn't exist in Smash right now. It's got really big, chunky limbs that it could use for attacking, and then that pipe on top of it actually splits in half, so you could use it especially for upwards-facing attacks as another set of limbs. That one's feeling pretty A tier to me. A decidedly different take on the quadruped idea, Mudsdale. It's a horse? Like, it really is just a horse, and it's pure ground type, so it would obviously use a lot of mud-based moves. Do I like it? I'm honestly having trouble deciding. This seems like a comedy tier to me. I don't think it's supposed to be a funny Pokemon, but I find it funny. And I gotta say, if you do want to take that approach, Mudbray would actually be a pretty great Echo Fighter. I'll take Rapidash a bit more seriously. It's still very much a horse, but it's not just a horse. You know, it's a fire unicorn. There's definitely more moveset potential there. It's got all of the same horsey kick attacks, just delivered a bit more daintily, and then you've got that horn to skewer people on, and obviously is going to throw out a lot of fire attacks, probably more on the physical side. And then Galarian Rapidash, just straight up My Little Pony. It's Psychic Fairy, which is definitely a more interesting typing compared to pure fire, especially in context of what's already in Smash. Its signature ability, Pastel Veil, just protects against poison. That doesn't really have any use. I'm kind of split between these two because as far as being physically aggressive quadruped designs, they're both decent. I think it actually fits into the original Rapidash better, but obviously Galarian Rapidash is more interesting. You know what? I'm just going to put them both in B tier. I'm not even going to worry about the Echo Fighter thing. I'd be happy with either of them about the same. Okay, so I was going to put the Ponytas in functional Echo Fighter because the original Ponyta doesn't have the horn, but Galarian Ponyta does, which means it works way better in the role. Okay, that puts it over the edge for me. Galarian Rapidash is going to stay in B tier, and OG Rapidash is going to get just use the evolution, which is where I'll put the original Ponyta as well. Okay, now what happens if you put something on the horse? This may be getting a bit into the clunky side for Smash, but because Calyrex is so much smaller than Glastrier or Spectrier, I don't think it's really that substantially different than just bringing a quadruped horse into Smash, which is, I think, somewhat doable. If anything, making the body shape more upright makes it fit in a bit better. It would be a very big character, but I don't think unmanageably big. Ice Rider Calyrex is the physical attacker, and Shadow Rider Calyrex is the special attacker. They both have similar abilities, knock an opponent out, and your attack stat or your special attack stat get buffed. I've talked a little bit about how that mechanic would work already. I thought it worked then, I think it works now. So there are a lot of decent parts in place. The question is really just more, how do you want to take this? I think because Calyrex can ride either mount, you could get away with a pretty seamless stance change system here. No need to make it insane this time around, just a basic Zelda Sheik transformation dynamic, where Ice Rider Calyrex is much heavier and has a focus on physical attacks, and then Shadow Rider Calyrex is more mobile and has more projectiles. And the neat thing is some moves would still carry over between both forms, because whenever Calyrex itself is attacking, which it wouldn't be doing that much, but it's still got a giant head, so maybe for its upwards moves, that's going to stay exactly the same regardless of which form it's riding. And because the Ice Rider's Chilling Neigh increases attack when it knocks an opponent out, and Shadow Rider's Grim Neigh increases special attack, I think you maintain that buff just on the one horse. And then as a Smash character, I think it would be cool if you designed them to have very polarizing elements, so you have to make a difficult decision sometimes about whether you want to keep the buff or you want to switch into the more optimal form. I still think they're potentially a bit too clunky, but the concept of a horse rider character is really intriguing, and there's a fair amount to work with. A tier. And who the hell cares about any of them individually? Urshifu, the other form-changing Gen 8 legendary. This one's so insanely obvious. It's got the Rapid Strike and the Single Strike forms. Rapid Strike, a bunch of small attacks. Single Strike, bigger, heavier attacks. They look essentially identical to each other, so it's pretty easy to just make this like a stance system. It knows Unseen Fist, which bypasses protection style moves, so that's just a straight up shield breaker or unblockable attack. That one kind of writes itself. In fact, a lot of this moves that kind of writes itself. The main thing is just how you want to package it. In canon, Cubfu is supposed to walk one of two paths, the path of darkness or the path of water, and then permanently transform into one of these. So you know what? Rather than having it do like an in-game dynamic stance change thing, something like Zelda and Sheik again, I think you select what form it's going to use beforehand, kind of like that Genesect drive idea I was talking about, except there's only 2 of them. That's the most faithful way to do it, which I do value quite a bit. Once you do that, though, you just kind of end up with 2 relatively basic fighting Pokemon. A more agile one that probably has some more counter-attacking moves in there, and then just a straight-up all-out attacker. Both of which are playstyles that are already represented in Smash. Yes, it's easy to see it dynamically switching forms. Yes, it's easy to see it just as a regular Pokemon with some moves being Rapid Strike style and some moves being Single Strike style, but you kind of need to start breaking away from the canon if you want to do that, which I have established I'm going to penalize in this video. The other thing you could do is start the battle off as Kubfu, and then partway through it evolves into either Single Strike or Rapid Strike, and maybe that's based on your actions. Oh, you know, that's got some potential to it, and then you stay in the Urshifu form for the rest of the game. That'd be really hard to manage, way more nuanced than I can dedicate time to in this video, but that's an idea for sure. I'm gonna put him in S tier purely on the basis of this walking the path concept working out in practice. If it was just Urshifu I was talking about, honestly, even though they're really obvious picks, I find them kind of boring, but as a package deal, I think you could probably come up with something pretty great for this. You know who they apparently couldn't come up with something great for? Dunsparce. Not a standout Gen 2 Pokemon, but it's good enough, and it waited patiently for an evolution for many years, and then they dropped Dunsparce, the same thing with one more body segment. I wouldn't respect myself. I've got to have standards of some kind. Okay, it's about time we talk about the Ice Cream Cone, definitely one of the most controversial Pokemon ever made. I'm not willing to go to bat for Vanillux too hard, but it's far from the most offensive Gen 5 Pokemon for me. Yeah, it's kind of a stupid idea, but the evolution line makes a lot of sense, and the final result is at least visually decently pleasant. Comedy tier. More so the comedy of the reactions people would have if this thing ever made it in. 1 scoop's gotta be half as funny as 2 scoops though. And hey, while we're talking about controversial Gen 5 Pokemon, Dabuz is gonna come back on to talk about Garbodor.
Garbodor, I don't know how to pronounce his name. That like literal giant piece of garbage. I literally thought this on a whim. I'm like, what's something really stupid to be added in Smash that's never gonna happen? And obviously, this Pokemon I think would just be like kind of a close range grappler-esque character, pretty slow, pretty heavy, hits pretty hard. I was thinking you can give him a lot of like space control moves, like you can use like his Smog or Sludge Bomb, kind of like a Piranha Plant like Poison Cloud to control space. Give its attacks a literal like poison effect, so it does like damage over time. Maybe get things like Body Slam, so it's like when you're up close, it has like these really powerful cash out moves. You know what we're actually give it like Explosion, or maybe give like a command grab, like he just like grabs you and he just like yeets you across the stage, or like he can move with you like a DK would. All I know is this Pokemon would probably stink, literally be like garbage tier, because he's a slow grappler, hard-hitting character. I can't imagine having good recovery. Just like the idea of like fighting this thing is so cursed, and I'd love to see it in a game just for how cursed it actually is.
As for Trubbish, I could debate different Echo Fighter placements, but it's also garbage. Or is it trash? Or rubbish. Dancy. As far as standalone legendaries go, really not that interesting if we're just drawing from the games, honestly. It's a diamond-based rock Pokemon. We have plenty of stuff like that. In the show, though, or more accurately the movies, she had a bunch of Carbinks following her around, so I think that's where you draw more inspiration from. And then this character starts getting interesting, because you can have like a puppet dynamic going on, placing Carbinks on the stage, and then you could have her firing light beams that intersect with the Carbinks in different ways. You could set up these reflection matrices, with the backing of 2 typings that we're not using in Smash right now. The body shape would work okay. Hovering just above the ground with this wouldn't actually look too odd. Yeah, you need to maybe stretch things out a bit, but this could work pretty well. I'm gonna put them both in A tier as a package deal. Okay, so this entire time I've had Sandy Shock sitting down here in the Mega tier, because even though Scarlet was the game I played, I totally forgot this was a Paradox Pokemon. Didn't exactly leave much of an impression on me. I'll give it D tier instead of F, because at least it has legs, so it's technically more compatible than the rest of the Magnemite line. Fluttermane, a far more impactful Paradox Pokemon. First I want to talk about Mismagius though. I know I've already talked about a Hex-focused Pokemon, but Mismagius would also make so much sense, a literal witch who also learns Hex and a bunch of status moves. It is directly competing against Bannet for a pretty specific role though, and when you compare the two, Mega Bannet has proper arms, whereas Mismagius just has strips of cloth that are supposed to look like arms. You could make them work for sure, but they're not as good. Both of them would need to hover slightly above the ground, but Mega Bannet can stay upright quite convincingly, whereas Mismagius is always illustrated with a heavy slant. It doesn't have that in-lore leaking curse element or that marionette style animation potential. In fact, its animation of like that slow, flowing, soft motion with the skirt as the body, that exists on plenty of Pokemon. I think I have to put it in an upstage tier, and I didn't come in planning to do that. I really like Mismagius as a Pokemon, but when I think of anything anything it brings to the table, the body shape, the moveset, the archetype, the spellcaster gimmick. There are just way too many other Pokemon that we've looked at or are gonna look at who do it better in my eyes. Which is not a Smash moveset by itself, you need to set it in more concrete terms. But it is still a really cool theme though, and I like Mismagius. It makes sense to me to put it here though. Is this too harsh? I'm gonna put a pin in it for now. I may come back to this one. And Fluttermane, while it's an incredibly strong competitive Pokemon, and I think one of the cooler looking Paradox Pokemon, if nothing else just because it updates Misdreavus, who's also cool, it does have the fluttering mane, which you could kind of use as arms, but it's also very small, and it's got a shorter quote-unquote skirt, so even if you did have it hover just above the ground, it wouldn't look as natural. A very squat Pokemon, kind of hard to fit in, and its actual core moveset isn't really offering anything that unusual. You could make it work, but just barely. This is like a D tier that's a really cool D tier, which gives it like a bump up into low C, I guess. And Misdreavus is essentially the same Pokemon, but not as cool, doesn't have the same potential for the fake arms, move pool smaller. The Gen 8 fossils. Okay, I get what they're doing here. They're fossils that weren't actually put together properly, which mirrors some real events that took place in the UK. That's cool. Nice real world inspiration. It's a shame that the end results are so unpleasant. Now, personally, as someone who really likes the fossil Pokemon in the generations that have them, I was really annoyed when this is what popped out, but I know a lot of people got a kick out of them, so I will reluctantly put them in comedy tier, except for you. You just need to go. Scolipede. This body shape doesn't totally work. The major issue for me is the lack of arms. It could also potentially stay very low to the ground as the centipede, but it holds itself upright, so that's not as big a deal. It does have the ability to roll into a ball, which even though for a lot of people that doesn't have the best connotations across the entire Smash series, that does give it some moveset potential for sure. It's got those long horns and a long abdomen that would function as a tail, including some essentially horns on the end of that too, so there is stuff to work with here. It also has the speed boost ability, which in Pokemon ups its speed by a stage at the end of every turn, so you could maybe have a bit of a Regigigas thing here, where it's like a momentum-based fighter. It gets faster and faster as the fight progresses, but a little less extreme. B tier, I can kind of see it. The other two, not so much. Venipede is a bug, and Whirlipede is a bug ball. Not even a funny enough one for comedy tier, so sad. Another bug ball, Tarantula, which takes kind of a weird evolution leap into Spidops. I think I might actually like Spidops though. It's Spider-Man, but an 8-limbed Spider-Man, and an 8-limbed spy on top of that. You could make moves like Silk Trap, String Shot, and Sticky Web, essentially the basis of its entire moveset. A lot of tether moves and burst movement options and silk projectiles, just basically make it Spider-Man, seriously. Then it has some interesting movement and attack potential with the 8 limbs that are held more like 4 most of the time. You just break them apart when needed. It's got Stakeout as an ability, which does more damage to Pokemon switching in, so why not just have that in Smash as a fun little passive where the first hit you land on an opponent who's respawned is extra powerful. Honestly, I'm shocked I'm doing this. S tier. I want 8-legged Spider-Man in Smash. That's something I'm finding out about myself. Tarantula can join the funny orbs. It's a goof. Wait, what is Double doing here? Get up there. Glalie another ball, and yeah, it's kind of nothing. The horns aren't enough to give it a real moveset, and it's not even that funny. I have no idea why this one got a Mega Evolution. Frostlass though, Snorunt's female equivalent. This one's got some potential to it. Obviously a way more fitting design, almost humanoid, but with the arms coming off of its head, and while it definitely does have something of a weather identity, that doesn't totally dominate it. There's nothing that really makes it jump out to me, but this seems like a B tier, very functional, and I do like the design of Frostlass, much more than Glalie as either a Pokemon or a Smash character, and then Snorunt can join it and just use the evolution. I think I might even like this one's design more than Glalie though. Corsola is your typical floppy fish, the Galarian form's right there with it, and then Cursula, less typical, and I guess you could have this one floating around if you really wanted to, but look at it. Quillfish in the same boat, or I guess not in the same boat, that's the whole point. Same with the Sui and Quillfish, too round to walk, too serious to be funny. And then Overquill, this one's really not moving outside the water. Alright, then back on dry land, after a few years away, welcome Introspecktive back to the channel.
Fuecoco would be perfect for Smash. I mean, you have Charizard and Pichu already, so just put them together and there you go. Fuecoco, sure, he's only a foot tall, but he has all the tools required to fight in this game. Neutrals, aerials, and smash attacks, all covered. Razor sharp chomper. Just look at that top tooth. He may only have nubs for hands, but he can definitely throw them. Fury swipes for his jab, perhaps? And that tail? Give the whole thing a sweet spot to compensate for the length. Just shut up, alright? He's a growing boy. But his up air would be his strongest move, thanks to his, 2 hairs? If you get killed by those two, then we call that chucking the deuces. He's a little guy, so he can do no more than an ember for his neutral B. But it would be cool to leave a fire on the stage that he can knock opponents into for combos, kinda like the Belmonts, except you can have multiple around the stage at once, and way cooler because it's Fuecoco. Side B can be a rollout type move, If Yoshi can roll around, then so can this dino looking boy. Maybe it can leave behind a trail of flames as well that functions like his ember. If you haven't guessed by now, I really just want a character who can light up the entire stage on fire. Up B can be overheat, where he charges and then launches upward with a hitbox, but also takes some damage. Guess he really is like Zard and Pichu. This can be angled and has a lot of kill potential. It would be really cool to combo into from the fire traps that I mentioned before. Also, based on how long you charge it, is how strong and far it goes. And for down B, he has a counter. Nah, I'm kidding. I think it would be cool to have a sort of status effect defensive move like Mud Slap that stacks. Land it 3 times within a time period, and your opponent's next attack that should land will miss. Again, easy to stack thanks to your fire traps if you catch your opponents in them, but it also puts out your fire traps if you hit them with mud, so you have to be careful throwing it out. I think that'd be a cool mechanic. But ideally, pass on the Rock Smash to my man Fuecoco. If Charizard no longer has it, then I would at least want to see a 1-foot-tall Dino Croc smashing a comically large rock with his forehead. Hopefully this moveset could make him top tier. I mean, there has to be at least one fire-type starter in this game that makes it there, right? Who am I kidding? Just look at this adorable little guy, of course he's top tier!
So I guess that kicks off talking about the Gen 9 starters, Crocolore. You know, starter middle evolutions don't exactly have the best track record, but this one's a winner in my eyes. The egg in the middle of the sombrero is a fun design, and I like what it's leading into. That said, what it is leading into, Skeledirge, is so much better. This is one of my favorite starter designs ever. A flaming ghost crocodile who fights alongside a little fiery bird. That is such a cool concept. Now, how does that translate into being a Smash character? He's kind of low to the ground, unfortunately. I'm willing to overlook that to a certain extent for a few reasons. He does stand upright sometimes. I don't think enough to make him stand upright as his idle stance in Smash, but you could maybe consider it. I'm almost willing to force it through because there's so much moveset potential with him fighting in tandem alongside the bird. Admittedly, a bit like Duck Hunt, but with way less focus on spawning stuff in and just making the bird itself the projectile. Maybe using Torch Song as the neutral special and then a couple of other moves that can launch it out, and then maybe some ways to control it while it is out, sort of self-intercepting it before it makes its way back to Skeledirge, and then it's got those giant jaws and a big sturdy tail. So there is so much moveset potential there, and I love the design. I can't get over the low quadruped thing completely, though. That is going to factor in. I can't resist A tier, though. Yes, there absolutely is a lot of bias going on here. I love Skeledirge, just the one I picked. But having said that, apart from the one flaw, which you can force your way around, it's really rare for a starter to come pre-packaged with this much moveset potential. And honestly, Crocolore, I'm putting in the same tier, because I think if you wanted to do another, like, Pokemon trainer type character who uses starters but not starters from Gen 1, and you didn't feel comfortable using the quadruped Skeledirge, Crocolore is a perfectly fine substitute. Quaquaval. See, this one's body shape fits right into Smash. Skeledirge was the singer Pokemon, but this is the dancer Pokemon. A lot of the moveset is fairly obvious. It would clearly use dancer style moves. Its signature move is Aqua Step, which raises the user's speed, and I think it would make sense to treat that quite literally, use Aqua Step as a burst movement option, and if it connects on an opponent, Quaquaval gets a speed boost for a little bit. It has Torrent as an ability, which boosts its water type moves when it's at low health, and in Smash you could literally have it do the exact same thing, a comeback mechanic that only applies to its water type moves, some of that type awareness I was talking about bringing in from earlier in the video. Interesting dynamic on a lightweight Pokemon. We already do have a lightweight character with a comeback mechanic in Smash, Sephiroth, and it can create some tuning issues and can feel a bit wonky, but I think it's still worth exploring. This should be a clear-cut S tier, except god I hate this thing. Oh my god, it looks so stupid moving around. It sticks out like a sore thumb compared to basically any other Pokemon. I am certified not a fan. Really happy I didn't choose the duck. I almost chose the duck. Alright, it's an S tier. As far as Quaxley and Quaxwell go, those are both getting A tier. They're relatively functional Echo Fighters to begin with, and again, if you wanted to do that Pokemon trainer pulling from starters that aren't Gen 1 thing, the water hair alone gives either of these a decent amount of moveset potential, and their body shapes are good too. This applies to Sprigatito and Floragato as well, and as far as Meowscarada goes, yeah, no, this is the clear-cut S tier. In fact, it's so clear-cut that I think it does push everything else down to A, except Fuecoco, of course. It's a biped with a mask and cape and claws, all of which create additional attack routes. It's got this definitive magician direction to take. Delzathan did an entire video on Meowscarada, so check that out if you got time. But in the meantime, I've brought him on to talk about a different Pokemon, and there's actually a bit more to that. A little ways back on this channel, I did a video completely reworking Ganondorf from the ground up for Smash, and then on my second channel, Mock Rock Talk, I made another video reacting to some fan movesets that other YouTubers YouTubers created. Delzathan's video on Ganondorf was one of 3 I looked at there, along with And Yet No Bananas and Fiber Optic Broadbean, and I asked if all 3 of them would be interested in coming and talking about some Pokemon, and yeah, they were all on board. I was really into all of their Ganondorf Smash movesets, so let's see what else they can do.
So this Gen 7 trio missed the boat originally, possibly because the super prominent Dusk form became a big deal several months after Ultimate picked its Gen 7 newcomer. Which is a shame, because there's something really cool here. Smash still doesn't have an Earthbender character, and this one could do interesting stuff with a hard-hitting Stone Edge, Trap Hazard Stealth Rock, and more. Could even tap into the Dusk form's alternate Fury mode, like Ash's Lycanroc in the anime, for a short-lasting buff to attack speed in certain conditions, and you'd have a fan-favorite newcomer in the making. That damn near need a miracle to get in now, despite how popular the line still is.
So personally, not only did I have ideas about how a new Pokemon trainer would go, but my specific candidate would have always been Cynthia. Specific humans have been severely underrepresented in Smash Bros, and few trainers have been as cool and compelling and vibes as her. And in my mind, her team would compose of Togepi, pre-evolution of a Pokemon she already has and adored by all in their own right, Lucario, stripped down a little bit for balance, and her star Pokemon, the ferocious, also effortlessly cool Dragon Ground type Garchomp. As we can clearly see, they have 7 means of attack right off their body. Legs and arms, of course, but we also have a tail. Always a source of far-reaching attacks, despite the hurtbox issues. And then there's the teeth. Technically any character could use biting attacks, and a lot of them do, but like, it's a shark. I think his forward smash in particular would be a great candidate for a great big bite attack. Let us not forget the dorsal fin. Huge backspike that you could have him spin to slice or back thrust to impale. Now as for specials, there's a lot you can do with the Dragon Ground type, but the most obvious that hasn't been implemented in a character yet is digging, laying low in the ground with low speed but high maneuverability. Essentially a stance change with new moves you can play with as you come out. Now, any ground type Pokemon could have this move, but Garchomp is especially suited to it because of that dorsal fin, fulfilling the gameplay fantasy of being a shark and also being something easily readable for gameplay purposes. Aside from that, there are many things you can do with the rest of the moveset. From earthquakes to sand attacks to dragon rushes to dragon breaths. My personal thought would be to give him a side B similar to Terry's neutral B, except it's the earth tearing apart, and in the air it's a spike. So is the digging one, come to think of it. Not sure how you dig in the air. And up B being Draco Meteor, functioning similar to Mithras except it goes higher and more maneuverable, because at their weight class they're gonna need it. In short, Garchomp is more solid than the earth they tear apart, not only having an obvious direction they ought to go, but having versatility in what else they can do. I give Garchomp an S for shark. Because even if he had no legs or arms, I would be arguing for it anyway.
Kingler would be a hilariously impractical character to use in Smash, with his moveset revolving entirely around that giant claw. We're talking big, heavy swings. When you make a move with this guy, you have to commit to it. Throw in a Vice Grip command grab, a Pyrostyle Crabhammer recovery, give him liquidation, and get the Smash roster some crustacean representation. B tier.
As for the stragglers, most of them go and just use the evolution, except for Gabite, who's a functional Echo Fighter because it's essentially Garchomp light, doesn't really offer anything. And Krabby would be a good Echo Fighter because it's at least a bit cuter and has 2 equally sized pincers. There's your difference. Then we've got Crawdaunt, who is a bit of a retread of Kingler, but it's a crayfish this time, and I think its body shape actually works better for Smash. Basically everything we just heard about Kingler applies to it as well. Is it as remembered as Kingler? No, and I do think that having 2 differently shaped claws gives you a bit of moveset potential because you can mix up lighter and heavier attacks depending on which claw you use, but I'd put it firmly alongside it. And yeah, Corphish as an Echo Fighter would be just fine. Bastiodon. This thing did not age especially well given that Zamazenta is now a thing. Sorry Bastiodon, you're upstaged. Shieldon would work quite well as an Echo Fighter though, obviously smaller and weaker and faster, and then you take away some of its armored elements as well. It's a pretty natural direction. Rampardos, the offensive element of this fossil line, this one works better. That said, it's called the Headbutt Pokemon, so yeah, it does a lot of headbutts, but so would a lot of Pokemon on this list, and it's known as a pure offense Pokemon, and that's essentially all it has to offer. We've already looked at a lot of these aggro type fighters that I think would work better. Hell, we've looked at them through the fossil lines. Yeah, I think they're both going in upstage for totally different reasons, funny enough. And then Cranidos, again a pretty good Echo Fighter. I don't think there's nearly as much potential there as with Shieldon because the armor element wouldn't be able to be played with in the same way, but because Rampardos is just a pure all-out aggression Pokemon, you could take some of that power away and redistribute it a bit. Baxcalibur is a Pokemon that takes that all-out aggro approach in a much more interesting direction. It's Ice Dragon type, and Ice in particular is known for having a lot of glass cannon cannon styles. I would definitely call that more interesting than Rampardos' pure rock typing. It's got a pretty solid bipedal form plus a really long tail and what I think is like a bladed sail on its back, so it's got a lot of attack routes. Its signature move is Glaive Rush, which as you'd expect for a glass cannon is incredibly powerful, but the trade-off is that during the next turn, opponents can't miss and their attacks do extra damage. So in Smash, you could just treat that as like a burst movement option that's really powerful but has a lot of lag if it misses. It could be kind of interesting as well though if you made it just an overall really good burst movement tool, but afterwards there was maybe a speed debuff on Baxcalibur for a bit, and maybe also that debuff prevented you from blocking, or prevented you from dodging, or let you still block, but your shield took a lot of damage, and then the debuff just wore off after a little while. It's the pseudo-legendary of Gen 9, so a relatively well-known and well-liked Pokemon. It doesn't necessarily do any one thing better than other Pokemon on this list do, but I'm feeling a pretty solid A tier. Arctibax would actually function really well as an Echo Fighter, and it's even cute. It's a middle evolution, but it looks more like a first stage. And that's because the actual first stage, Frigibax, looks like this. Someone needed to be cute. Yeah, you're getting just to use the evolution, and frankly, it's holding onto its place in Pokemon by a thread. Cherim. It's a Pokemon that stays in one form most of the time, but when it's exposed to harsh sunlight, it changes into a different form. Weather doesn't work. Dragonite, one of the original pseudo-legendaries. This one's fun, a big roly-poly dragon. I gotta say though, it's overlapping a lot with Charizard. Making it orange and green is not doing it any favors, but even besides that, in the context of Smash, Charizard is already the heavyweight dragon. I know that Dragonite is literally a dragon and Charizard is not, but that is absolutely splitting hairs for these purposes. I'm sorry, Dragonite, I like you, but you're upstaged. And actually, Melodic is upstaging Dratini and Dragonair pretty hard as well. I guess while I'm here, I'll clean up the Gen 1 fossils. Never got to before. Yeah, this isn't going to be a long process. Omastar has the tentacles, which vaguely resembles something you could make a moveset out of, but other than that, this is another one of those, we're talking about a platform fighter situations here. As for Aerodactyl, it is better. Those wings are looking pretty flappy, but it does have at least a bit of the wyvern design going on with the hands in the middle, so it could crawl around. That said, I don't think it's really particularly well set up for it. It would have to be lurching around a lot more compared to something like Noivern, and also it's just not really bringing that much to the table. Yeah, it's got the jaw I could attack with. Yeah, I could throw out a couple rock moves, but I could say that about plenty of Pokemon, and it really does just feel like it should be in the air. It's based on a Pterodactyl. That's its biggest selling point. Rock flying is a somewhat interesting type juxtaposition, but Aerodactyl just isn't that well set up to deliver either half of it. I was about to put Aerodactyl in D tier, but you know what I think I'm going to do instead? I'm going to bring Mega Aerodactyl into the mix, because this one delivers way more on the rock half of things, and I could see it being grounded much more comfortably. Looks a lot heavier, and it could prop itself up on those rock points and use them as attack vectors. Is it insane? No, but I think that actually gives it the bump to C, at the cost of demoting the original. Mandibuzz is not escaping the Flappy Wings fate, though. Vullaby, its pre-evolution, would actually work better here, because at the very least, it has a reason for not being in the air. It doesn't look like it should be flying around majestically. And to be fair, Mandibuzz as a vulture isn't at the absolute top of the Majesty scale, but nah. Good try though. Hey, look at that, the Gen 9 birds. Nope, not a single survivor. Ice-Cue. Okay, this is a bird that's something more. This one has at least a bit of a fun gimmick if nothing else. It starts out in Ice Face mode, and then if it gets hit by a physical move, it takes no damage, and instead some of that ice breaks off and it goes into Noise Face mode, or No Ice Face mode. I actually honestly don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that. And then if it starts hailing or snowing, it goes back into Ice Face form. And weather doesn't work, but a goofy penguin with ice on its head, that works, if by works you mean makes me chuckle. Another one that makes me laugh? Bellybolt. Big, slow, plodding electric frog. Yeah, we've seen frogs, we've seen electric types, but a full-on proper electric heavyweight who attacks with its gut? That's kind of fun. It's got electromorphosis for an ability, which means that if it's hit by an attack, the power of its next electric move goes up, which you could treat as a type-sensitive counter like I talked about a little while ago. It's another Pokemon that learns Parabolic Charge, which makes maybe even more sense on a heavyweight. You could have it be like a damage sponge kind of design. This is a B tier. It's not doing anything insane, but it would definitely work. Tadbulb is actually pretty fun too, but way too simple. It's no Echo Fighter. Now, in theory, I'm sure you could also do something with Sentret and Furret, but these are some of those normal Pokemon that you're not supposed to remember later. Audino is skirting that line dangerously closely. This one at least has the healer ability, so sometimes it heals a teammate, but that is not applicable to Smash. Why is there a Mega Audino on my screen? Normal Purge. Normal Purge. I know the Pokemon Company really wanted me to like Lechonk. I could not care less. Normal Purge! Normal Purge! I'm pretty sure Watchog was the one that Scott the Woz sent in for that Alpharad video, and that's gotta be the most attention any human being has ever given it. Okay, Arceus, a fun normal type. This one has a bit of an awkward body shape, I'll give you that. But given its status as the originator of all Pokemon, I want each individual move to be a canonical Pokemon attack, and if that means manifesting plenty of different types of energy all over the place, I'm fine with it. It's got a huge move pool in the Pokemon series, and I definitely want that taken advantage of. As for Judgment, its signature move, that one changes type depending on the plate that Arceus is holding, a bit like Genesect's Drive, except this time around, you can choose any type plate rather than just being limited to 5, so that whole pick before the battle starts thing is too clunky. What I think would work instead is make it a delayed projectile that rains down from above, pretty much how it appears in Pokemon, and have its typing and therefore some properties of it change depending on the type of whatever the last move that Arceus used was. In Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, my main Korra works like this. Every single move that she has is assigned to one of the 4 classical elements, except for her neutral air, one of the centerpieces of her kit, which changes element depending on the element of the last move she used, and then it gets new traits with it. Arceus' body would honestly probably work pretty well as is, and then it's the god of all Pokemon, so much moveset potential, so many directions you could take it. This would just feel weird not to put S, and it's one of those Pokemon that's so important you could actually somewhat reasonably expect to see it show up in Smash at some point. Alright, going from the creator god of all Pokemon to something a bit more reasonable scale, here's Design Doc coming on to talk about Drifloon.
Yeah, that's right. When was the last time you thought about Drifloon? In Smash, it'd be a lightweight and mobile air fighter, along the lines of Jigglypuff, but with one important difference. Ever read Drifloon's Pokédex entries? There's some wild stuff in there. Drifloon's whole game plan is gonna be grappling and carrying people up to the ceiling for a KO. Its throws and up throw are gonna be strong, obviously, but the main appeal is in Drifloon's specials. The side special is Airlift. It's a mix of the Beetle item and Ganondorf's Dunking side special. Drifloon dashes forward and wraps around their opponent, then shoots up towards the ceiling before releasing. The higher the percentage, the higher you go. The other couple of specials support Airlift, and I guess we should put in some actual moves in here. Its neutral special is Shadow Ball, a straightforward projectile that can mark a target on contact, making them easier to airlift. And let's really commit to the bit and make the up special not even a recovery move. Let's do Astonish instead, a faster, close-range move that stuns a target within its radius, like Zero Suit Samus's stun gun. A stun target should be easy to airlift, right? Hey, remember when I said that the Pokédex had some wild stuff in there? Yeah, Drifloon is more effective against the kids. Young Link, Ness, Lucas, y'all better watch yourselves. Is this moveset balanced? Nah. Is it so single-minded that it becomes a comedy? I think so. D tier for Drifloon.
And then for Drifblim, honestly, it doesn't get much less sinister. Normally, I'd probably work with Drifblim and assign Drifloon an Echo Fighter, but you know what? Drifloon works. I'm just gonna go with the flow and give them both the same tier. Kecleon. The concept behind this is kind of intriguing, if nothing else, right? It's a chameleon Pokemon, and it has 2 abilities. Color Change switches it to the type of whatever move it was hit with. That's a bit rough to work with, but its other one is Protean, which changes it to the type of whatever move it last used. So I could see almost a bit of a Magic series system where it, for example, has a light, medium, and heavy attack assigned to particular typings, and those are all sort of designed to cascade into each other. You could also just make it another one of these Pokemon that has a huge amount of moves from all across different typings. That doesn't necessarily totally reflect how it actually works, though. And being a chameleon Pokemon, you could play around with visibility a little bit. I think it's kind of a poor man's version of some of these other shifting concepts, but the body shape's there. I think a very solid B tier. It's another one of those concepts that would probably excite me a lot more if some other Pokemon didn't exist. Hydreigon. This is an interesting one. It is flying in its animation and it has 6 wings, but of its 3 heads, only the main head is real, so you could actually have this one crawling around on the ground and it would work okay. If you are okay with it being grounded, it's actually got a lot going for it. It could use its arm heads for biting and gripping attacks. It's got those 6 wings to work with. You could use like Steel Wing, maybe put that on an up special, have it be really powerful. You could give it Tri-Attack with all 3 heads. A couple of ways I can think of that working. You could make it a projectile like it appears in the Pokemon series, or you could make it, say, a forward smash with all 3 heads, and then it's got a random chance to inflict one of those 3 fundamental status conditions: burn, freeze, paralyze. And then Iron Jugulis, or Jugulis, the Paradox Pokemon, just give that some of the booster energy changes like I was talking about for Screamtail, and you've got a perfectly functional Echo Fighter. This comes down to how okay you are having it walking around. I know it's not animated that way. I'm okay with it. A tier. I know I said that Lugia's chances were hurt because it would look creepy crawling around on the ground with this kind of body type, but look at this thing. I don't think being creepy is really a problem. In fact, I think you probably could even have it lumbering around upright. I'm pretty sure it does that in the show. But screw it. Make it crawl around anyways, pull a King K rule. Some nice Echo Fighter material for the Paradox. I don't think I'd pick it as his own thing though. And then Dino and Svilas, their shapes aren't really compatible. Beartic. I get it, big, strong, ice type heavyweight, but man is it a plain design. If I try to think of anything this Pokemon does, be a heavyweight, be a bear, be an ice type, rely on weather moves. That's not a good one, but it does it too. There's not a single case where I can't think of plenty of Pokemon that do it better. There are a couple underwhelming positions I could put this, but let's say weather doesn't work because it has 3 different abilities and all of them are entirely based on weather. It's probably the least weather associated Pokemon on this list, and if there was something more interesting going on, I'd be willing to overlook that, but there's not really. As for Cubchoo, it's pre-evolution. Okay, little bear swinging its frozen snot bubble at people, I'll give you something for that. Coffegregious. This one is actually kind of interesting. Its body shape definitely does have issues. It's obviously not flexible in the torso at all, but you could have it float just above the ground or even be dragged along the ground and it would work okay. And it obviously has those 4 big flexible shadow arms, so you could make a moveset out of it. Its lore is reminiscent of King Tut's Curse, so it would make sense to have a very counter-based style. In fact, you could even use Curse. In Pokemon, when a ghost type specifically uses Curse, it loses a huge chunk of its health, but then it also places a massive damage over time effect on its opponent. Supercharged poison, essentially. I think that could be translated as a very interesting counter attack in Smash, where you still take full damage from the attack, even magnified damage, but then your opponent gets a massive damage over time effect placed on them. You could get a really interesting translation of Shadow Claw using all 4 of those arms. Forward Smash would be the go-to option, but picture like a forward air where all 4 of those arms are swinging through as this flurry type attack and all of them have a tipper mechanic. And then Runeregis, its Galarian form, doesn't really work as an Echo Fighter, unfortunately. Its limbs are just too different, or the things serving as limbs, but the actual core concept translates over just fine. Personally, I actually prefer Runeregis, but the original is definitely the more iconic one, the more familiar one, slightly more in theme with how well known the Egyptian curses are in pop culture, so it's gonna get the B tier. Runeregis, I'd love to put it as an Echo Fighter, but you just have to change too much. And then Yamask and Galarian Yamask will join it down and just use the evolution. Shout out. It's well known for being the only Pokemon that could ever swear because you used to be able to record your own audio for it. I don't know how they didn't see that coming, but doesn't even have that going for it anymore. Just a pair of wings. Reuniclus. This is an interesting one. I think it's themed around cells dividing. When I see its body shape, the first thing that comes to mind is Grappler, but it's actually a psychic type. I think that's because it's using its psychic powers to hold cytoplasm together. It's kind of a cool design. I think you could have it hover just above the ground just fine, and I don't think it's supposed to be transforming its shape too much, but you could have it bend and stretch a little. A grappler with psychic abilities, that's really not bad. I'm gonna go A tier for this. I actually think it's pretty interesting. Duosion and Solosis, not nearly so much. They're blobs. Kingambit. New evolution of Bisharp introduced in Gen 9. Really striking design. It is depicted as sitting more often than not in Pokemon, but that's totally fine and it would actually make a fun idle stance. Clearly a huge amount of moveset potential without outrageous helmet or head. I actually don't know. It's called the Big Blade Pokemon. I mean, duh. Its signature move is Kowtow Cleave. It's nothing really special. It just always hits. Doesn't even bypass guards or anything. It's just really accurate. And then it's got a few different abilities, but really it's got one ability, Supreme Overlord, which boosts its power for each Pokemon that's already been defeated on your party. That's a really cool distinctive ability in Pokemon. It doesn't really directly translate into Smash at all. You could maybe generously stretch it to be some kind of passive that boosts your stats for each stock you're down, or the equivalent in other game modes, but that's just Diet Lucario. I really do like the original more. Obviously, in a team fight, you could translate this okay, but you can't really design a passive like that to just work with teams. Still, it does have other abilities, even if the competitive scene doesn't really tend to place much focus on them, and it's got a pretty good blade-based moveset, and its body type is really well set up. I think I'm gonna go A tier on that one. Some points off for its signature ability not really working. Bisharp worked totally fine as its own thing before Kingambit came around, but now that it's here, it is a lower evolution, so it's kind of awkward to fit in. It would feel weird treating it as its own standalone thing. I think I'm gonna go functional Echo Fighter on this because if you take away the head moves from Kingambit and replace them with some different head moves using Bisharp's own helmet/head, that could be the Echo Fighter difference. I don't think it's fantastic, and Kingambit's body design is far more interesting. It is there as an option, though. Ponyard, at this point, we're making a watered-down copy of a watered-down copy. Just use the evolution. Slurpuff. Okay. You ever see that Cartoon Network meme with the 3 dragon heads? Not necessarily where you want to be taking your art direction from. Bruxish. It's a psychic fish, so I guess it could float around on land, and it is based on the Humu Humu Nuku Nuku Apua, which is fun to say if nothing else, so I'll go to bat for it a little bit more than most fish. And it's even got more personality than a lot of fish Pokemon, but it can't escape its fate. Absol. This is a cool Pokemon. I know this is an absolute fan favorite, and personally, I prefer the design of the base Absol to its Mega Evolution, But if we're looking at moveset potential, I think it's pretty inarguable that adding the wings gives quite a lot more. Now, it's a quadruped with multiple jumps, and it can use those wings to attack, along with its head scythe, of course, which you know is going to come out a lot. Mega Absol's ability is Magic Bounce, which bounces back status type moves. I think in Smash, it's a reasonable translation to just make it a standard reflector. It's not perfect, but plenty of Smash moves pulled from Pokemon have been stretched way more than that. It's a Foresight Pokemon that can predict the future, so it's using a counter. At this point, we are getting into quite a bit of Pokemon that I'm suggesting using counters for, but it really fits. You could also just give it exceptional roll and spot dodge stats if you wanted to take a different approach. As much as I love the design of Absol like a lot of people, and as much as there is some stuff to work with, there are limitations as well. I don't think it necessarily does a lot of stuff better than a lot of Pokemon, and that head scythe, while it would work as a weapon, it's got that awkward head movement thing that I've talked about before. Having said that, add the wings of Mega Absol onto that, and I think you get something pretty interesting. I'm going A tier. And base level Absol, I'm still going to put in B tier because I suspect a lot of people would like to see it. Jumping from one fan favorite to another here, Eevee and the Eeveelutions. There are a few different ways I can picture to tackle these things both individually and as a collective. How could they work individually? A-Star the Third is coming back to the channel to talk about his favorite Eeveelution and how that could work.
Mock set off a ton of neurons in my mind, thinking about all the cool ways that I could make a cool moveset for Umbreon. Dark type Pokemon, defensive, tanky, doesn't have a lot of damage output, right? So I really wanted to lean into that. So we got a medium-sized Pokemon, fairly fast, right? Got a good recovery, but low damage output. And the Pokemon will struggle to KO, because tanks generally have a problem with that, unless they have good defensive play. They'll also have some issues with being outranged. So Umbreon has a little passive going on where, you know how stages have shadows under platforms? If there's a shadow on stage, Umbreon's rings will begin to glow, right? And if Umbreon makes any contact moves while glowing like this, its moves will have a little toxic effect that'll do damage over time, like a little extra 2 to 3%. Not every stage is gonna have more shadows to take advantage of, but it's a little small thing that nods back to Umbreon's Pokedex entries. So neutral special is going to be Mean Look. If Umbreon is able to get off the Mean Look, it's gonna be a small range little glance at the opponent. It'll immensely reduce the opponent's movement speed, their air speed, and it'll reduce their iframes during roll, spot dodges, and air dodges. So the point of this move is to lock down the opponent, right? Stops the opponent from using a bunch of defensive options in their movement to escape. It'll be really good in doubles too. Side special will be Moonlight, this sort of giant, medium-sized projectile that moves a little bit slowly. Fair amount of startup, and the moon itself won't do much damage. It'll just push back opponents. But the thing about it is that it has this light, and if Umbreon stands in this light, it'll recover some of the damage that it takes. If it is in doubles, then any of Umbreon's allies will also be recovered. So it's a really cool recovery move, right? The biggest caveat is that it's a slow projectile with a fair amount of startup. Up special will be Feint Attack, so Umbreon basically disappears and then reappears in a set location, kind of like Warp, but if there's an opponent nearby, it'll attack. So a good old recovery that goes a fair amount of distance, intangible because you're disappearing. Now, the real big thing here is foul play. So foul play, think of it like Game & Watch Bucket, right? Umbreon takes a defensive stance, a glowing defensive stance. It'll absorb any damage. After a certain amount of damage is taken, it'll charge it up, kind of like, again, Game & Watch's Bucket. It'll release back a powerful attack depending on this damage threshold that it's taken. So the whole intention of Umbreon is to tank these hits, right? Take all of that damage and be able to dish it back out at the opponent. As such, Umbreon will probably be incentivized to take a lot of damage. If it takes too much, obviously you'll get KO'd, which is how you leverage using Moonlight. So that's the caveat. You don't want Umbreon to heal, and you want to make sure that you're careful playing around foul play. You got a normal paw swipe for its jab, right? A tail whip maybe for the down tilt. F smash, I was thinking of Assurance, where it has super armor, and if you hit it, then it does increase damage, similar to how Assurance works in Pokemon. Snarl as its F tilt. So it's a little shout. It has low knockback, low damage, but it reduces enemy damage output by 10%. So reducing the amount of damage that the opponent does might work a little bit opposite of what you would want for foul play, but it does help with Umbreon's longevity. So yeah, you're gonna have heavies that are gonna live to extremely high percents potentially, but it really matters how you use foul play, because if you use foul play well, you will be able to score tons of KOs. Obviously, foul play would have some recovery frames too that you could take advantage of if it misses it. So I think Umbreon would be a really cool addition. I hope you guys like it. And thank you, Mock, for having me.
And as for how you make them all work, easy. Bring in Penny. She's an important trainer to Gen 9's story who entirely focuses on Eeveelutions, and with how broad the coverage for Eeveelutions are, I think they're another great option for having a trainer physically enter the battlefield. You need a fast move, Jolteon. Powerful move, Flareon. Sylveon comes in with the defense, rise into the air on Leafeon's magical leaf, maybe good old Eevee can come out for a grab similar to how Olimar uses Pikmin. There's so much potential. Back when I was talking about Eevee as a standalone character during my last take on this concept, I put it in F tier, and yeah, I don't think it really works by itself. It's a terrible standalone fighter, and you can't really have it evolve and then de-evolve. That's just not really how Eevee is supposed to work. Put them all together, as they should be though, and Eevee gets the biggest jump possible, all the way up into S tier. And you know what? For a bit of housekeeping, I am moving Miss Magus. It's cool, okay? And I think that seems like a very natural place to wind down part 1 of what turned out to be an even more ridiculous project than I expected it to be. There are so many Pokemon, and oh my god, there's so many Pokemon left. But my voice is totally shot, so I'm gonna take a few days off, then get to work on part 2. Hope to see you there. Later, people.